Introduction. "I would ask you a favor," said the German captain, as we sat in the cabin of a U-boat which had just been added to the long line of bedraggled captives, which stretched themselves for a mile or more in Harwich Harbor, in November 1918. I made no reply. I had just granted him a favor by allowing him to leave the upper deck of the submarine in order that he might await the motor launch in some sort of privacy. Why should he ask for more? Undeterred by my silence, he continued, "I have a great friend, Lieutenant Zussi von Schenk, who brought U-Point 122 over last week. He has lost a diary, quite private. He left it in error. Can he have it?" I deliberated, felt a certain pity, then remembered the Belgian prince and other things, and so, looking the German in the face, I said, "I can do nothing. Please." I shook my head then, to my astonishment. The German placed his head in his hands and wept. His massive frame, for he was a very big man, shook in irregular spasms. It was a most extraordinary spectacle. It seemed to me absurd that a man who had suffered, without visible emotion, the monstrous humiliation of handing over his command intact, should break down over a trivial incident concerning a diary, and not even his own diary. And yet there was this man crying openly before me. It rather impressed me, and I felt a curious shyness at being present, as if I had stumbled accidentally into some private recess of his mind. I closed the cabin door, for I heard the voices of my crew approaching. He wept for some time, perhaps 10 minutes, and I wished very much to know of what he was thinking, but I couldn't imagine how it would be possible to find out. I think that my behavior in connection with his friend's diary added the last necessary drop of water to the floods of emotion which he had striven successfully, to hold in check during the agony of handing over the boat. And now, the dam had crumbled and broken away. It struck me that, down in the brilliantly lit, stuffy little cabin, the result of the war was epitomized. On the table were some instruments I had forbidden him to remove, but which my first lieutenant had discovered in the engineer officer's bag. On the settee lay a cheap, imitation leather suitcase, containing his spare clothes and a few books. At the table sat Germany in defeat, weeping, but not the tears of repentance, rather the tears of bitter regret for humiliations undergone and ambitions unrealized. We did not speak again, for I heard the launch come alongside, and as she bumped against the U-boat, the noise echoed through the hull into the cabin, and aroused him from his sorrows. He wiped his eyes, and with an attempt at his former hardiness, he followed me on deck and boarded the motor launch. Next day I visited U-Point 122, and these papers are presented to the public, with such additional remarks as seemed desirable. For some curious reason, the author seems to have omitted nearly all dates. This may have been due to the fear that the book, if captured, would be of great value to the British Intelligence Department if the entries were dated. The papers are in the form of 2 volumes in black leather binding, with a long letter inside the cover of the second volume. The Diary of a U-Boat Commander. 1 volume of my war journal completed, and I must confess it is dull reading. I could not help smiling as I read my enthusiastic remarks at the outbreak of war, when we visualized battles by the week. What a contrast between our expectations and the actual facts. Months of monotony, and I haven't even seen an Englishman yet. Our battle cruisers have had a little amusement with the coast raids at Scarborough and elsewhere, but we battle fleet fellows have seen nothing and done nothing. So I have decided to volunteer for the U-boat service, and my name went in last week, though I am told it may be months before I am taken, as there are about 250 lieutenants already on the waiting list. But sooner or later, I suppose something will come of it. I shall have no cause to complain of inactivity in that service, if I get there. I am off tonight for a 6 days trip, 2 days of which are to be spent in the train to the Verdun sector. It has been a great piece of luck. The trip had been arranged by the Military and Naval Intercommunication Department, and 2 officers from this squadron were to go. There were 130 candidates, so we drew lots. As usual, I was lucky and drew one of the 2 chances. It should be intensely interesting. I arrived here last night after a slow and tiresome journey, which was somewhat alleviated by an excellent bottle of French wine, which I purchased whilst in the Champagne district. Long before we reached the vicinity of Verdun, it was obvious to the most casual observer that we were heading for a center of unusual activity. Hospital trains traveling northeast and east were numerous, and twice our train, which was one of the ordinary military trains, was shunted on to a siding to allow troop trains to rumble past. As we approached Verdun, the noise of artillery, which I had heard distantly once or twice during the day, as the casual railway train approached the front, became more intense and grew from a low murmur into a steady noise of a kind of growling description, punctuated at irregular intervals by very deep booms, as some especially heavy piece was discharged, or an ammunition dump went up. The country here is very different from the mud flats of Flanders, as it is hilly and well wooded. The Meuse, in the course of centuries, has cut its way through the rampart of hills which surround Verdun, and we are attacking the place from 3 directions. On the north, we are slowly forcing the French back on either riverbank, a very costly proceeding, as each wing must advance an equal amount, or the one that advances is enfiladed from across the river. We are also slowly creeping forward from the east and northeast in the direction of Douaumont. I am attached to a 105 cm battery, a young Major von Markel in command, a most charming fellow. I spent all today in the advanced observing position with a young subaltern called Grable, also a nice young fellow. I was in position at 6 a.m., and as apparently is common here, mist hides everything from view until the sun attains a certain strength. Our battery was supporting the attack on the north side of the river, though the battery itself was on the south side, and firing over a hill called Elham Mort. Von Markel told me that the fighting here has not been previously equaled in the war. Such is the intensity of the combat, and the price each side is paying. I could see for myself that this was so, and the whole atmosphere of the place is pregnant with the supreme importance of this struggle, which may well be the dying convulsions of decadent France. His Imperial Majesty himself has arrived on the scene to witness the final triumph of our arms, and all agree that the end is imminent. Once we get Verdun, it is the general opinion that this portion of the French front will break completely, carrying with it the adjacent sectors, and the French armies in the Vosges and Argonne will be committed to a general retreat on converging lines. But favorable as this would be to us, it is generally considered here that the fall of Verdun will break the moral resistance of the French nation. The feeling is that infinitely more is involved than the capture of a French town or even the destruction of a French army. It is a question of stamina. It is the climax of the World War, the focal point of the colossal struggle between the Latin and the Teuton. And on the battlefields of Verdun, the gods will decide the destinies of nations. When I got to the forward observing position, which was situated among the ruins of a house, a most amazing noise made conversation difficult. The orchestra was in full blast, and something approaching 12,000 pieces of all sizes were in action on our side alone. This being the greatest artillery concentration yet effected during the war. We were situated on one side of a valley, which ran up at right angles to the river, whose actual course was hidden by mist, which also obscured the bottom of our valley. The front line was down in this little valley, and as I arrived, we lifted our barrage on to the far hillside to cover an attack which we were delivering at dawn. Nothing could be seen of the conflict down below, but after half an hour, we received orders to bring back our barrage again, and Grable informed me that the attack had evidently failed. This afternoon, I heard that it was indeed so, and that one division, the 58th, which had tried to work along the riverbank and outflank the hill, had been caught by a concentration of 6 batteries of French 75s, which were situated across the river. The unfortunate 58th, forced back from the riverside, had heroically fought their way up the side of the hill, only to encounter our barrage, which, owing to the mist, we thought was well above and ahead of where they would be. Under this fresh blow, the 58th had retired to their trenches at the bottom of the small valley. As the day warmed up, the mist disappeared, and like a theater curtain, the lifting of this veil revealed the whole scene in its terrible, and yet mechanical splendor. I say mechanical, for it all seemed unreal to me. I knew I should not see cavalry charges, guns in the open, and all the old-world panoply of war. But I was not prepared for this barren and shell-torn circle of hills, continually being freshly, and to an uninformed observer, aimlessly lashed by shell fire. Not a man in sight, though below us the ground was thickly strewn with corpses. Overhead, a few aeroplanes circled round amidst balls of white shell bursts. During the day, the slow-circling aeroplanes, which were artillery observing machines, were galvanized into frightful activity by the sudden appearance of a fighting machine on one side or the other. This happened several times. It reminded me of a pike amongst young trout. After lunch, I saw a Spad shot down in flames. It was like Lucifer falling down from high heavens. The whole scene was enframed by a sluggish line of observation balloons. Sometimes groups of these would hastily sink to earth, to rise again when the menace of the aeroplane had passed. These balloons seemed more like phlegmatic spectators at some athletic contest than actual participants in the events. I wish my pen could convey to paper the varied impressions created within my mind in the course of the past day, but it cannot. I have the consolation that, though I think that I have considerable ability as a writer, yet abler pens than mine have abandoned in despair the task of describing a modern battle. I can but reiterate that the dominant impression that remains is of the mechanical nature of this business of modern war. And yet such an impression is a false one. For as in the past, so today, and so in the future, it is the human element which is, has been, and will be the foundation of all things. Once only in the course of the day did I see men in any numbers, and that was when at 3 p.m. the French were detected massing for a counterattack on the south side of the river. It was doomed to be stillborn. As they left their trenches, distant pygmy figures in horizon blue, apparently plodding slowly across the ground. They were lashed by an intensive barrage, and the little figures were obliterated in a series of spouting shell bursts. 5 minutes later the barrage ceased, the smoke drifted away, and not a man was to be seen. Grable told me that it had probably cost them 750 casualties. What an amazing and efficient destruction of living organism. Another most interesting day, though of a different nature. Today was spent witnessing the arrangements for dealing with the wounded. I spent the morning at an advanced dressing station on the south bank of the river. It was in a cellar, beneath the ruins of a house, about 400 yards from the front line and under heavy shell fire. As close at hand was the remains of what had been a wood, which was being used as a concentration point for reserves. The cover afforded by this so-called wood was extremely slight, and the troops were concentrating for the innumerable attacks and counterattacks which were taking place under shell fire. This caused the surgeon in charge of the cellar to describe the wood as our main supply station. I entered the cellar at 8 a.m., taking advantage of a partial lull in the shelling, but a machine gun bullet viciously flipped into a wooden beam at the entrance as I ducked to go in. I was not sorry to get underground. A sloping path brought me into the cellar, on one side of which sappers were digging away the earth to increase the accommodation. The illumination consisted of candles set in bottles and some electric hand lamps. The center of the cellar was occupied by 2 portable operating tables, rarely untenanted during the 3 hours I spent in this hell. The atmosphere, for there was no ventilation, stank of sweat, blood, and chloroform. By a powerful effort, I countered my natural tendency to vomit and looked around me. The sides of the cellar were lined with figures on stretchers. Some lay still and silent, others writhed and groaned. At intervals, one of the attendants would call the doctor's attention to one of the still forms. A hasty examination ensued, and the stretcher and its contents were removed. A few minutes later, the stretcher empty returned. The surgeon explained to me that there was no room for corpses in the cellar. Business, he genially remarked, was too brisk at the present crucial stage of the great battle. The first feelings of revulsion having been mastered, I determined to make the most of my opportunities, as I have always felt that the naval officer is at a great disadvantage in war as compared with his military brother, in that he but rarely has a chance of accustoming himself to the unpleasant spectacle of torn flesh and bones. This morning there was no lack of material, and many of the intestinal wounds were peculiarly revolting, so that at lunchtime, when another convenient lull in the torrent of shell fire enabled me to leave the cellar, I felt thoroughly hardened. In fact, I had assisted in a humble degree at 1 or 2 operations. I had lunch at the 11th Army Medical Headquarters mess, and it was a sumptuous meal to which I did full justice. After lunch, whilst waiting to be motored to a field hospital, I happened to see a battalion of Silesian troops about to go up to the front line. It was rather curious feeling that one was looking at men, each in himself a unit of civilization, and yet many of whom were about to die in the interests thereof. Their faces were an interesting study. Some looked careless and debonair, and seemed to swing past with a touch of recklessness in their stride. Others were grave and serious, and seemed almost to plod forward to the dictates of an inevitable fatalism. The field hospital, where we met some very charming nurses, on one of whom I think I created a distinct impression, was not particularly interesting. It was clean, well organized, and radiated the efficiency inseparable from the German army. Back at Wilhelmshaven Cursit, yesterday morning, when about to start on a tour of the ammunition supply arrangements, I received an urgent wire recalling me at once. There was nothing for it but to obey. I was lucky enough to get a passage as far as Mons in an Albatross Scout, which was taking dispatches to that place. From there, I managed to bluff a motor car out of the town commandant, a most obliging fellow. This took me to Aachen, where I got an express. The reason for my recall was that Witnesser went sick, and Arnheim being away. This has left only 2 in the operations ciphering department. My arrival has made us 3. It is pretty strenuous work, and being of a clerical nature, suits me little. The only consolation is that many of the messages are most interesting. I was looking through the back files the other day, and amongst other interesting information, I came across the wireless report from the boat that had sunk the Lusitania. It has always been a mystery to me why we sank her, as I do not believe those things pay. Arnheim has come back, so I have got out of the ciphering department to my great delight. I have received official information that my application for U-boats has been received. Meanwhile, all there is to do is to sit at this hole and wait. June 1916. I have fought in the greatest sea battle of the ages. It has been a wonderful and terrible experience. All the details of the battle will be history, but I feel that I must place on record my personal experiences. We have not escaped without marks, and the good old Koenig brought 67 dead, and 125 wounded into port, as the price of the victory off Skagerrak. But of the English there are thousands who slept their last sleep in the wrecked hulls of the battle cruisers, which will rust for eternal ages upon the Jutland banks. Sad as our losses are, and the gallant Lutzow has sunk in sight of home, I am filled with pride. We have met that great armada, the British fleet. We have struck them with a hammer blow, and we have returned. I was asleep in my cabin when the news came that Hipper was coming south with the British battle cruisers on his beam. In 5 minutes, we were at our action stations. We made contact with Hipper at 5:30 p.m., and Beatty turned north with his cruisers and fast battleships, and we pursued. 2 of the great ships had been sunk by our battle cruisers, and we had hopes of destroying the remainder, when at 6:55, the mist on the northern horizon was pierced by the formidable line of the British battle fleet. Jellicoe had arrived. 3 battle cruisers became involved between the lines, and in an instant one was blown up, and another crawled west in a sinking condition. Sudden and terrible are events in a modern sea battle. Confronted with the concentrated force of Britain's battle fleet, we turned to east, and for 20 minutes our high seas fleet sustained the unequal contest. It was during this period that we were hit 17 times by heavy shell, though, in my position in the after torpedo control tower, I only realized one hit had taken place, which was when a shell plunged into the after turret and, blowing the roof off, killed every member of the turret's crew. From my position, when the smoke and dust had blown away, I looked down into a mass of twisted machinery, amongst which I seemed to detect the charred remains of bodies. At about 7:40 we turned, under cover of our smoke screen, and steered southwest. Our position was not satisfactory, as the last information of the enemy reported them as turning to the southward. Consequently, they were between us and Heligoland. At 11 p.m., we received a signal for divisions of battle fleets to steer independently for the Horn Reef-swept channel. 10 minutes later, we underwent the first of 5 destroyer attacks. The British destroyers, searching wide in the night, had located us, and with desperate gallantry pressed home the attack again and again. So close did they come that about 1:30 a.m. we rammed one, passing through her like a knife through a cheese. It was a wonderful spectacle to see those sinister craft, rushing madly to their destruction down the bright beam of our powerful searchlights. It was an avenue of death for them, but to the credit of their service, it must stand that throughout the long nightmare they did not hesitate. The surrounding darkness seemed to vomit forth flotilla after flotilla of these cavalry of the sea. And they struck us once, a torpedo right forward, which will keep us in dock for a month, but did no vital injury. When morning dawned, misty and soft, as is its way in June in the Bight, we were to the eastward of the British, and so we came honorably home to Wilhelmshaven, feeling that the young Navy had laid worthy foundations for its tradition to grow upon. We are to report at Kiel, and shall be 6 weeks upon the job. Frankfurt, back on 17 days' leave, and everyone here very anxious to hear details of the Battle of Skagerrak. It is very pleasant to have something to talk to the women about. Usually the gallant field greys hold the drawing-room floor, with their startling tales from the Western Front, of how they nearly took Verdun, and would have if the British hadn't insisted on being slaughtered on the Somme. It is quite impossible in many ways to tell that there is a war on as far as social life in this place is concerned. There is a shortage of good coffee, and that is about all. Arrived back on board last night. They have made a fine job of us, and we go through the canal to the Schillig roads early next week. We are to do 3 weeks gunnery practices from there, to train the new drafts. 1916, about August. At last, thank heavens, my application has been granted. Schmidt, the secretary, told me this morning that a letter has come from the Admiralty to say that I am to present myself for medical examination at the board at Wilhelmshaven tomorrow. What joy to strike a blow at last, finished forever the cursed monotony of inactivity of this high seas fleet life. But the U-boat war, that goes well. We shall bring those stubborn, blood-sucking islanders to their knees by striking at them through their bellies. When I think of London and no food, and Glasgow and no food, then who can say what will happen? Revolt, rebellion in England, and our brave field greys on the west will smash them to atoms in the spring of 1917. And I, Karl Schenk, will have helped directly in this. Great thought, but calm. I am not there yet. There is still this confounded medical board. I almost wish I had not drunk so much last night. Not that it makes any difference, but still one must run no risks, for I hear that the medical is terribly strict for the U-boat service. Only the cream is skimmed. Well, tomorrow we shall see. Passed, and with flying colors. It seemed absurdly easy and only took 10 minutes, but then my physique is magnificent, thanks to the physical training I have always done. I am now due to get 3 weeks' leave, and then to Zeebrugge. I have wired to the little mother at Frankfurt. At Zeebrugge, or rather Bruges. I spent 3 weeks at home. All the family are pleased except mother. She has a woman's dread of danger. It is a pleasing characteristic in peacetime, but a cloy on pleasure in days of war. To her, with the narrowness of a female's intellect, I really believe I am of more importance than the fatherland. How absurd. Whilst at Frankfurt, I saw a good deal of Rosa. She seems better looking each time I meet her. Doubtless she is still developing to full womanhood. Moritz was home from Flanders. He had 10 days' leave from Ypres, and though I have a dislike for him, he certainly was interesting. Though why the English cling to those wretched ruins is more than I can understand. I felt instinctively that in a sense Moritz and I were rivals where Rosa was concerned, though I have never considered her in that light as yet. One day, perhaps. These women are much the same everywhere, and I could see that having entered the U-boat service made a difference with Rosa, though her logic should have told her that I was no different. But is that right? After all, it is something to have joined this service. The guards themselves have no better cachet, and it is certainly cheaper. Here we live in billets and in a commandeered hotel. The life ashore is pleasant enough. The damned Belgians are sometimes sulky, but they know who is master. Bissing, a splendid chap, sees to that. As a matter of fact, we have benefited them by our occupation. The shops do a roaring trade at preposterous prices, and shamefully enough the German shopkeepers are most guilty. These pot-bellied merchants don't seem to realize that they exist owing to our exertions. I was much struck with the beautiful orderliness of the small gardens which we have laid out since 1914, and in fact, wherever one looks there is evidence of the genius of the German race for thorough organization. Yet these Belgians don't seem to appreciate it. I can't understand it. I find here that social life is very much gayer than at that mad town of Wilhelmshaven. At the high seas fleet bases, there was the strictness and austerity that some people seem to consider necessary to show that we are at war, though heaven knows there was precious little war in the high seas fleet. Perhaps that was why the blood and iron regime was in full order ashore. Here, in Bruges, at any rate as far as the submarine officers are concerned, the matter is far different. When the boats are in, one seems to do as one likes, with a perfunctory visit to the ship in the course of the day. Witness the Commodore favors complete relaxation when in from a trip. In the evenings, there are parties, for which there are always ladies, and I find it is necessary to have a smoking. I went to the best tailor to buy one, and found that I must have one made at the damnable price of 140 marks. The fitter, an oily Jew, had the incredible impertinence to assure me it would be cut on London lines. I nearly felled him to the ground. Can one never get away from England and things English? I'll see his account waits a bit before I settle it. There are several fellows I know here. Karl Müller, who was third watchkeeper in the York, and Adolf Hilfsbaumer, who was captain of G.176, are the two I know best. They are both doing a few trips as second in commands of the later UC boats, which are mine-laying off the English coasts. This is a most dangerous operation, and nearly all the UC boats are commanded by reserve officers, of whom there are a good many in the mess. Excellent fellows, no doubt, but somewhat uncouth and lacking the finer points of breeding. As far as I can see in the short time I have been here, they keep themselves to themselves a good deal. I certainly don't wish to mix with them. Unfortunately, it appears that I am almost bound to be appointed as second in command of one of the UC boats, for at least one trip before I go to the periscope school and train for a command of my own. The idea of being bottled up in an elongated cigar and under the command of one of those nautical plowboys is repellent. However, the von Schenks have never been too proud to obey in order to learn how to command. I have been appointed second in command to UC.47. Her captain is one Max Alton by name. Beyond the fact that I saw him drunk one night in the mess, I know nothing of him. I reported to him, and he seems rather in awe of me. His fears are groundless. I shall make it as easy as possible for him, for it must be as awkward for him as it is unpleasant for me. To celebrate my proper entry into the U-boat service, I gave a dinner party last night in a private room at Le Coq d'Or. I asked Karl and Adolf, and told them to bring 3 girls. My opposite number was a lovely girl called Zoe something or other. I wore my smoking for the first time. It is certainly a becoming costume. We drank a good deal of champagne and had a very pleasant little debauch. The girls got very merry, and I kissed Zoe once. She was not very angry. I think she is thoroughly charming, and I have accepted an invitation to take tea at her flat. She is either the wife or the cheer Amy of a colonel in the Brandenburgers. I could not make out which. Luckily, the gallant cockchafer is at the moment on the La Bassée sector. Where I was interested to observe that heavy fighting has broken out today. I must console the fair Zoe. Both Karl and Adolf got rather drunk, Adolf hopelessly so. But I, as usual, was hardly affected. I have a head of iron, provided the liquor is good, and I saw to that point. We were sailing, or rather going down the canal to Zeebrugge on Friday, but the starting resistance of the port main motor burnt out, and we were delayed till Sunday, as they will fit a new one. I must confess the organization for repair work here is admirable, as very little is done by the crews in the U-boats, all work being carried out by the permanent staff, who are quartered at Bruges docks. Taking advantage of the delay, I called on Zoe Stein, as I find she is named. It appears she is not married to Colonel Stein. She told me he was fat and ugly, and laughed a good deal about him. She showed me his photograph, and certainly he is no beauty. However, he must be a man of means, as he has given her a charming flat, beautifully decorated with watercolors, which the Colonel salved from the French shade-ow in the early days. These army fellows had all the chances. I bade an affectionate farewell to Zoe, and I trust Stein will be still busily engaged at La Bassée when I return in a fortnight's time. I am greatly obliged to Karl for the introduction, and told him so. He himself is running after a little grass widow, whose husband has been missing for some months. I think Karl finds it an expensive game. Luckily, Zoe seems well supplied with money, the essential ingredient in a joyous life. On Friday night, we had an air raid, a frequent event here, but my first experience in this line. Unpleasant, but a fine spectacle, considerable damage done near the docks, and an unexploded bomb fell in a street near our headquarters. 2 machines, British, brought down in flames. I saw the green balls for the first time. A most fascinating sight to see them floating up in waving chains into the vault of heaven. They reminded me of making daisy chains as a child. At Zeebrugge, we are alongside the mole in one of the new submarine shelters that has been built. The boat is under a concrete roof over 3 feet thick, which would defy the heaviest bomb. We have much improved the port since our arrival. The port, so called, is purely artificial, and actually consists of a long mole with a gentle curve in it, which reaches out to seaward and protects the mouth of the canal. The tides are very strong up and down the coast, and constant dredging is carried out to keep 20 feet of water over the sill at the lock gates. On arrival last night, we went straight into number 11 shelter, as an air raid was expected, but nothing happened, so I went up to the Flander, which seems to be the best hotel here, full of submarine people, and I heard many interesting stories. There seems no doubt this U-boat war is dangerous work. I find the UC boats are beginning to be called the Suicide Club, after the famous English story of that name, which, curiously enough, I saw on the kinematograph at Frankfurt last leave. We Germans are extraordinarily broad-minded. I doubt if the works of German authors are seen on the screens in England or France. The news from the West is good. The English are hurling themselves to destruction against our steel front. We are now to load up with mines. I must stop writing to superintend this work. At sea, near the South Dogger Light, we loaded up the 10 mines we carry in an hour and 5 minutes. They were lifted from a railway truck by a big crane and delicately lowered into the mine tubes, of which we have 5 in the bows. The tubes extend from the upper deck of the ship to her keel and slope aft to facilitate release. Having completed with fuel at Bruges, we took in a store of provisions, and Alton went up to the Commodore's office to get our sailing orders. We sailed at 6 p.m., and at last I felt I was off. Today, the 22nd, we are just north of the South Dogger, steering northwesterly at 9 to 1/2 knots. The sea is quite calm, and everything is very pleasant. Our mission is to lay a small minefield off Newcastle in the East Coast War Channel. I have, of course, never been to sea for any length of time in a U-boat, and it is all very novel. I find the roar of the diesel engine very relentless, and last night slept badly in a wretched bunk, which was a poor substitute for my lovely quarters in the barracks at Wilhelmshaven. One thing I appreciate, and that is the food. It is really excellent. Fresh milk, fresh butter, white bread, and many other luxuries. I have spent most of the day picking up things about the boat. Her general arrangement is as follows. Starting in the bows, mine tubes occupy the center of the boat, leaving 2 narrow passages, one each side. In the port passage is the wireless cabinet and signal flag lockers, with storerooms underneath. In the starboard passage are 1 or 2 small pumps and the kitchen. The next compartment contains 4 bunks, 2 each side. These are occupied by Alton, myself, the engineer, and the navigating warrant officer. Proceeding further aft, one enters the control room, in which 1 periscope is situated, and the necessary valves and pumps for diving the boat. The next compartment is the crew space. 10 of the company exist here. Overhead on each side is the gear for releasing the torpedoes from the external torpedo tubes, of which we carry 1 each side. I think we borrowed this idea from the Russians. Then comes the engine room, an inferno of rattling noises, but excellent engines, I believe. At the after end of the engine room are the 2 main switchboards, of whose manner of working I am at present in some ignorance. The 2 main sets of electric motors are underneath the boards, in the stern, where we have a 3rd torpedo tube. I had hardly written the above words when a message came that the captain would like me to come to the bridge. I went up in a leisurely fashion, through the conning tower, which is over the control room, and reported myself. He indicated a low-lying patch of smoke on the horizon far away on the starboard bow. I was obliged to confess that it conveyed nothing to me, when he aroused my intense interest by stating that it was, without doubt, being emitted from a British submarine, who are known to frequent these waters. He was proceeding away from us, and was, even then, 6 or 7 miles away, so an attack was out of the question. The engineer, who had joined us, drew my attention to the thin wisp of almost invisible blue-gray smoke from our own stern. The contrast was certainly striking. Over dinner I gave it as my opinion that the British boats were pretty useless. Alton would not agree, and stated that, though in certain technical aspects they were in a position of inferiority, yet in personnel and skill in attacking they were fully our equals. He seemed to hold them in considerable respect, and he remarked that, when making a passage, he was more anxious on their account than in any other way. He informed me that, on the last passage he made, he was attacked by a British boat which he never saw, the only indication he received being a torpedo which jumped out of the water almost over his tail. Luckily, it was very rough at the time, which made the torpedo run erratically. Otherwise, they would undoubtedly have been hit. What appeared to astonish him was the fact that the British boat had been able to make an attack in such weather. We are now charging on 1 engine, 500 amperes on each half battery. We are due back at Zeebrugge at 10 p.m. tonight. We should have been in at dawn today, but we received a wireless from the senior officer, Zeebrugge, to say that mine laying was suspected, and we were to wait till the QR. Channel, from the Blankenberg buoy, had been swept. We lay in the bottom for 8 hours, a few miles from the western end of the channel. Our trip was quite successful, but not without certain excitements. On the night of the 23rd, we passed fairly close to a fishing fleet on the Dogger Bank and saw the lights of several steamers in the distance. As our first business was to lay our mines in the appointed place, we did not worry them. We burnt usual navigation lights, or rather side lights, which appear to be usual, except that, by a little fitting which Alton has made himself, the arcs of bearing on which the lights show can be changed at will. His idea is that, should we appear to be approaching a steamer which he wishes to avoid, in many cases, by shining a little more or less red and green light, we can make her think that we are a steamer on such a course, that it is her duty, by the rules of the road, to keep clear of us. He tells me it has worked on several occasions, and he has also found it useful to have 2 small auxiliary side lights fitted, which are the wrong colors for the sides they are on. It is, of course, only neutral shipping which carry lights nowadays, though Alton says that many British ships are still incredibly careless in the matter of lights. However, to resume my account of what happened. We reached our position at dawn or slightly after. The weather was beautifully calm and the sea like glass. As we were only 3 miles from the English coast and close to the mouth of the Tyne, we were extraordinarily lucky to have nothing in sight, if one accepts a long smudge of smoke which trailed across the horizon to the southward. The land itself was obscured by early morning banks of mist, yet everything was so still that we actually faintly heard the whistle of a train. I could hardly restrain from suggesting to Alton that we should elevate the 10 cm, gun to 15 degrees, and fire a few rounds on to proud Albion's virgin shores. But I did not do so, as I felt fairly certain that he would not approve. And I do not wish to lay myself open to rebuffs from him after his behavior concerning the smoking incident. I boil with rage at the thought, but again, I digress. The fact that the land was obscured was favorable from the point of view that we were not worried by coast watchers, but unfavorable from the standpoint that we were unable to take bearings of anything and so ascertain our exact position. The importance of this point in submarine mine laying is obvious, for, owing to our small cargo of eggs, it is quite possible that we may be sent here again to lay an adjacent field, in which case it is highly desirable to know the exact position of one's previous effort. Steering northwesterly, to lay a small minefield off Newcastle, he had suddenly seen the bow waves of a destroyer approaching at full speed to ram. We were somewhat assisted in our efforts to locate ourselves by the fact that a 7-fathom patch existed exactly where we had to lay. We picked up the edge of this bank with our sounding machine, and steering north half a mile, laid our mines in latitude No. On second thoughts, I will omit the precise position, for, though I shall take every precaution, there is no saying that through some misfortune this journal might not get into the wrong hands. I am very glad I decided to keep these notes, as I shall take much pleasure in reading them when victory crowns our efforts and the joys of a peaceful life return. I found it a delightful sensation being so close to the enemy coast, in his territorial waters, in fact. For the first time since the Skagerrak battle, I experienced the personal joys of war, the sensation of intimate and successful contact with the enemy, and the most hated enemy at that. We had hardly finished laying our eggs when a droning noise was heard. With marvelous celerity we dived, that damned fellow Alton, who, under these circumstances, leaves the bridge last, treading on my fingers as he followed me down the conning tower ladder. The engineer endeavored to sympathize with me and made some idiotic remark about my being quicker when I had had more practice. I bit his head off. I can't stand this hail fellow well met attitude in these UC boats from any lout dressed in an officer's uniform. They wouldn't be holding commissions if it wasn't for the war, and they should remember that fact. I suppose they think I'm standoffish. Well, if they had my family tree behind them, they would understand. We dived to 60 feet and then came up to 20. Alton looked through the periscope and then invited me to look. Curiosity impelled me to accept this favor, and putting the focusing lever to skyscrape, I swept round the sky. At last I saw him. He was a small gas bag of diminutive size, beneath which was suspended a little car, the most ridiculous little travesty of an airship I have ever seen. He was nosing along at about 800 feet and making about 40 knots. Suddenly he must have seen the wake of our periscope, for he turned towards us. Simultaneously, Alton, from the conning tower, I was using the other periscope in the control room, ordered the boat to 60 feet and put the helm hard over. We had turned 16 points, and in about 2 minutes heard a series of reports right astern of us. It was evident that our ruse had succeeded and that he had overshot the mark. Inside the boat, one felt a slight jar as each bomb went off. We gradually came round to our proper course and cruised all day submerged at dead slow speed. Every time we lifted our periscope, he was still hanging about sufficiently close to make it foolish for us to come to the surface. Towards noon, a group of trawlers, doubtless summoned by wireless, appeared and proceeded to wander about. These seemed to concern Alton far more than the airship, and he informed me that from their, to me, aimless movements he deduced they were hunting for us by hydroplanes. Occasionally, we lay on the bottom in 19 fathoms. By 4 p.m., the atmosphere was becoming rather unpleasant and hot, and gradually we took off more clothes. Curiously enough, I longed for a smoke, but wild horses would not have made me ask Alton for permission. At 8 p.m., it was sufficiently dark to enable us to rise, which gave me great pleasure, though the first rush of fresh air down the hatch made me vomit after hours of breathing the vitiated muck. On coming to the surface, we saw nothing in sight, but a breeze had sprung up which caused spray to break over the bridge as we chugged along at 9 knots. Everyone was in high spirits, as always on the return journey, when the mind turns to the fatherland and all it holds. My mind turns to Zoe. I confess it to myself frankly. I hardly realized to what extent this woman had begun to influence me until we received the wireless signal ordering us to delay entering for 12 hours. The receipt of this news, trivial though the delay has been, threw a mantle of gloom over the crew. I participated in the depression, and upon thought, rather wondered that this should be so. Self-analysis on the lines laid down by Chessmanwale revealed to me that the basis of my annoyance is the fact that my next meeting with Zoe is deferred. I feel instinctively that I shall have trouble here, and that I had better haul off a lee shore whilst there is maneuvering room. And yet, I secretly rejoice that every revolution of the propeller, every clank and rattle of the diesels, brings us closer together. Alton has just come down from the bridge, and we chatted for some moments. It is evident that he wishes to apologize for his rudeness over the smoking incident. I was in error, I admit it frankly. At the same time, I did not know that the battery was on charge, and to dash a match from my hand. I could have shot him where he stood. However, I am not vindictive, and as far as I am concerned, the incident is ended. One thing I find trying in this small boat, and that is that I can find no space in which to do half my Mueller exercises, the leg and arm swinging ones. I must see whether I can't invent a set of U-boat exercises. Good, in 2 hours, we reach the Moland light buoy. Submarine Mess, Bruges. It is midnight, and as I write in my room at the top of the house, the low rumble of the guns from the southwest vibrates, faintly through the open window, for it is extraordinarily warm for the time of year, and I have flung back the curtains and risked the light shining. We spent the night at Zeebrugge and came up to the docks here next day. We shall probably be in for a week, and I am on 4 days, extended absence from the boat, which practically means that I can go where I like in the neighborhood, provided I am handy to a telephone. After a short inward struggle, I rang Zoe up on the telephone. Fortunately, I did not call first. A man's voice answered, and for a moment I was dumbfounded. I guessed at once it was the colonel, and I had counted so confidently on his being still away at the front. For an instant I felt speechless. An impulse came to me to ring off without further ado, but I restrained myself, and then a fine idea came into my head. "Who is that?" I said. "Colonel Stein," replied the voice, and my fears were confirmed, but my plan of campaign held good. "I am speaking," I continued, "on behalf of Lieutenant von Schenk." "Ah, yes," growled the voice, and for an instant a panic seized me, but I resumed. "He met Madame Stein at dinner some days ago, and she kindly asked him to call. He has asked me to ring up and inquire when it would be convenient, as he would like to meet you, sir, as well. He has been unable to ring up himself, as he was sent away from Bruges on duty early this morning." I smiled to myself at this little lie, and listened. "Your friend had better call tomorrow then, for I leave tomorrow evening for the Somme front. Will you tell him?" I replied that I would, and left the telephone well satisfied, but cursing the fates that made it advisable to keep clear of number 10, Strasse, for 36 hours. Needless to say, next day, I rang up again in order to tell the colonel that Lieutenant Schenk had apparently been detained, as he was not yet back in Bruges, and how I felt sure that he would be sorry at missing the colonel, etc., etc. But all this camouflage was unnecessary, as she herself came to the phone. I could have kissed the instrument when I told her of my stratagem and heard her silvery laughter in my ear. It is arranged that tomorrow, starting at 10:30, we motor for the day to the forest of Meeten, taking our lunch and tea with us, pray heaven the weather holds. Tonight in the mess, it is generally considered that UB.40 has been lost. She is 10 days overdue and was operating off Havre. She has made no signal for a fortnight. Such is the price of victory and the cost of war death, perhaps, in some terrible form, but bah! Away with such thoughts. Tomorrow there is love and life and Zoe. Once more it is night. Still the guns rumble on the same old dismal tones, and as it is raining now, it must be getting bad up at the front. Except for the rain, it might have been last night, but much has happened to me in the meanwhile. Today in the forest by Reiselt, I found that I loved Zoe, loved her as I have never yet loved woman, loved her with my soul and all that is me. The day was gloriously fine when we started, and an hour's run took us to the forest. We left the car at an inn and wandered down one of the glades. I carried the basket, and we strolled on until we found a suitable place deep in the heart of the forest. I have the sailor's love for woods, for their depths, their shadows, their mysteries, which are so vivid a contrast to the monotony of the sea, with the everlasting circle of the horizon and the half-bowl of the heavens above. In the forest today, though the leaves had turned to gold and red and brown, the beeches were still well covered, and overhead we were tented with a russet canopy. I say at last we found a spot, or rather Zoe, who, with girlish pleasure in the adventure, had run ahead, called to me, and as I write I seem to hear the echoes of Karl, which rang through the wood. When I came up to her, she proudly pointed to the place she had found. It was ideal. An outcrop of rock formed a miniature Matterhorn in the forest, and beneath its shelter, with the old trees, as silent witnesses we sat and joked and laughed, and made 20 attempts to light a fire. After lunch, a little incident happened which had an enormous effect on me. Zoe asked me whether I would mind if she smoked. How many women in these days would think of doing that? And yet, had she but known it, I am still sufficiently old-fashioned to appreciate the implied respect for any possible prejudices, which was contained in her request. After lunch, I asked her a question to which I dreaded the answer. I asked her whether, now that the old colonel had gone to the Somme, whether that meant that she would be leaving Bruges. She laughed and teasingly said, "Quin sabe, senor," but seeing my real anxiety on this point, she assured me that she was not leaving for the present. The colonel, she said, had a strange belief that once a man had served on the Flanders front, and especially on the Ypres salient, he always came back to die there. It appears that the colonel has done 14 months' service on the salient alone, and is firmly convinced he will end his career on that great burial ground. As we were talking about the colonel, I longed to ask her how she had met him, and perhaps find out why she lives with him. For I cannot believe she loves him, but I did not dare. Strangely enough, I found that a curious shyness had taken hold of me with regard to Zoe. I said to myself, "Fool, you are alone with her, you long to kiss her. You have kissed her, first at the dinner party, secondly when you said goodbye at her flat." And yet today it was different. Then I was kissing a pretty woman. I was on the eve of a dangerous life. And I was simply extracting the animal pleasures whilst I lived. Today it was a case of Zoe, the personality I loved. I still longed to kiss her, but I wanted to have the unquestioned right to kiss her, as much as I wanted the kisses. I wanted to have her for my own, away from the contaminating ownership of the old colonel, and I determined to get her. I think she noticed the changed attitude on my part, and perhaps she felt herself that a subtle change in our relationship had taken place. And whilst I meditated on these things, she fell into a doze at my side. I was sitting slightly above her, smoking to keep the midges away, and as I looked down on her childish figure, a great tenderness for her filled my mind. She is very beautiful, and to me desirable above all women. I can see her as she lay there trustfully at my feet. I will describe her, and then, when I get her photograph, I will read this when I am far away on a trip. She is of average height, for I am just over 6 feet, and she reaches to just above my shoulder. Her hair is gloriously thick and of a deep black color, and lies low on her forehead. Her complexion is of the purest whiteness beyond compare, which but accentuates the red warmth of the lips which encircle her little mouth. Her figure is slight, and her ankles are my delight, but her crowning glories, which I have purposely left till last, are her eyes. I feel I could lose my soul. I have lost it, if I have one, in the violet depths of those eyes, which were veiled as she slept by the long black eyelashes which curled up delicately as they rested on her cheeks. I have reread this description, and it is so unsatisfying. Would I had the pen of a Goethe or a Shakespeare, yet for want of more skill the description shall stand. How I long for her to be mine, and yet, unfortunate that I am, I cannot for certain declare that she loves me. 1,000 doubts arise. I torment myself with recollections of her behavior at the dinner party, when within 2 hours of our first meeting, she gave me her lips. Yet did I not first roughly kiss her as we danced? I find consolation in the fact that, though she has said nothing, yet her conduct today was different. She was so quiet after tea as we wandered back through the forests, with the setting sun striking golden beams aslant the tree trunks. Before we left, I sang to her Tchaikovsky's beautiful song, "To the Forest," and I think she was pleased, for I may say with justice that my voice is of high quality for an amateur, and the song goes well without an accompaniment, whilst the atmosphere and surroundings were ideal. There was only one jarring note in a perfect day. When we returned to the car, the chauffeur permitted himself a sardonic grin. Zoe unfortunately saw it and blushed scarlet. I could have struck him on his impudent mouth, but for her sake, I judged it advisable to notice nothing. I feel I could go on writing about her all night, but it is nearly 2 a.m. I must get some sleep. The guns rumble steadily in the southwest, and the sky is lit by their flashes. May the fighting on the Somme be bloody these coming days. We leave tonight, having had a longer spell than usual. I am in a distracted state of mind. Since our glorious day in the forest, I have seen her nearly every afternoon, though twice that swine Alton has kept me in the boat in connection with some replacements of the battery. I have found out that, like me, she is intensely musical. She plays beautifully on the piano, and we had long hours together playing Chopin and Beethoven. We also played some of Mussorgsky's duets, but I love her best when she plays Chopin, the composer preeminent of love and passion. She has masses of music, as the Colonel gives her what she likes. We also played a lot of Debussy. At first, I demurred at playing a living French composer's works, but she pouted and looked so adorable that all my scruples vanished in an instant. So we closed all the doors, and she played it for hours very softly, whilst I forgot the war and all its horrors, and remembered only that I was with the well-beloved girl. The Colonel writes from Thiepval, where the British are pouring out their blood like water. He writes very interesting letters, and has had many narrow escapes, but unfortunately he seems to bear a charmed life. His letters are full of details, and I wonder he gets them past the field censorship, but I suppose he censors his own. She laughs at them and calls them her Colonel's dispatches. She says he is so accustomed to writing official reports that the poor old man can't write an ordinary letter. I told her that I thought the way he mentioned regiments and dispositions rather indiscreet, and she agrees, but she says he has asked her to keep them, with a view to forming a collection of letters written from the front, whilst the incidents he describes are vivid in his mind. I suppose the old ass knows his own business, and one day the collection may be completed by a telegram, regretting to announce, etc., etc., the sooner the better. So the days passed pleasantly enough, and never by a gesture or word of mouth did she show that I was more to her than any other pleasant young man. I kissed her when I arrived. I kissed her when I left. Each day was the same. She would put her arms round my neck and look long and deeply into my eyes. Then she would gently kiss my lips. Not an atom of emotion, not a spark from the fires which I feel must be raging beneath that diabolically extraordinary, amazingly calm exterior. On ordinary subjects, she would chatter vivaciously enough, and she can talk in a fascinating manner on every subject I care to bring up. But as soon as I drew the conversation round to a personal line, she gradually became more silent, and a far-away and distant look came into those wonderful eyes. I have found out nothing about her beyond the fact that she has traveled all over Europe. I don't even know how old she is, but I should guess 26. I tried to find out a few details by means of discreet remarks at the club and elsewhere. She simply arrived here about a year ago as a singer, and met the Colonel beyond that all is mystery. Everything about her attracts me powerfully, and this mystery adds subtleties to her charms. This afternoon, I went to say goodbye. I told her we were leaving shortly, and she gently reproved me for disobeying the order which forbids discussion of movements. But I could see she was not greatly displeased. After tea, she played to me music of the modern Russian school Arensky, Sibelius, and Pilsudski. A storm was brewing, and we both felt sad. She played for an hour or so, and then came and sat by me on a low divan by the fire. We were silent for a long while in the gathering gloom, whilst 1,000 thoughts chased each other swiftly through my brain, as I endeavored to summon up courage to say what I had determined I must say before I left her, perhaps forever. At last, when only her profile was visible against the glow of the logs, I spoke. I told her quietly, calmly, and almost dispassionately that I had grown to love her, and that to me she was life itself. I told her that I had tried not to speak until I could endure no longer. She sat very still as I spoke, and when I had finished there was a long silence, and I gently stretched out my hand and stroked her lovely black hair. At last she rose, and with averted face walked across the room, and stood looking at the storm through the big bow windows. I watched her, but did not dare follow. At length she returned to me, and I saw what I had instinctively known the whole time, that she had been crying. I could not think why. She put her arms round my neck, kissed me on the forehead, and murmured, "Poor Karl." I felt crushed. I dared not move for fear of breaking the magic of the moment, yet I longed to know more. I felt overwhelmed by some colossal mystery that seemed to be enveloping me in its folds. Why did she pity me? Why did she weep? Why didn't she answer my avowal? Why didn't she tell me something? Such were some of the problems that perplexed me. It was thus when the clock chimed 7. I told her that my leave was up at 7 o'clock, and that at 7:15 I had to be back on board the boat. She remembered this, and in an instant the past quarter of an hour might never have existed. She was all agitation and nervousness, lest I should be late on board, though at the moment I would have cheerfully missed the boat to hear her say she loved me. I tried to protest, but in vain. With feminine quickness, she utilized the incident to avoid a situation she evidently found full of difficulty. And at 7:10, with the memory of a light kiss on my lips and her Godspeed in my ears, I was in a taxi driving to the docks in a blinding rainstorm, and we sail tonight. For 5, 6, 7, perhaps 10 days at the least, and at the most forever, I am doomed to be away from her and without news of her. And I don't even know whether she loves me. I think I can say she cares for me up to a certain point, but I want more. O Zoe, of the violet eyes and hair of blackest night, thy lips are brightest crimson. Thy skin is dazzling white. Oh, lay your head upon my breast, and lift your lips to mine. Then murmur in soft breathings, drink deep from what is thine. Then let the war rage onward, let kingdoms rise and fall. To each shall be the other, their life, their hope, their all. At sea, we are bound for the same old spot as last time. Alton must have been drinking like a fish lately. His breath smells like a distillery. He is apparently partial to schnapps, which he gets easily in Bruges. I can't help admiring the man, as he is a rigid teetotaler at sea, though he must find the strain well nigh intolerable, judging from the condition he was in when he came on board last night. He was really totally unfit to take charge of the boat, and I virtually took her down the canal. though with sottish obstinacy, he insisted on remaining on the bridge. This morning, though his complexion was a hideous yellow color, he seems quite all right. I shall play a little trick on him at dinner tonight. I have begun to get to know some of the crew by now. They are a fine lot of youngsters, with a seasoning of half a dozen older men. The coxswain, Schmidt by name, is a splendid old petty officer who has been in the U-boat service since 1911. His favorite enjoyment is to spin yarns to the younger members of the crew, who know of his weakness and play up to it. He has a favorite expression which runs thus: His Majesty, the Kaiser said Germany's future lies on the sea. I say Germany's future lies under the sea. He is inordinately fond of this statement, and the youngsters continually say, "What made you take to U-boat work, Schmidt?" And the invariable reply is as above. When he has been asked the question about half a dozen times in the course of a day, he is liable to become suspicious. And if his questioner is within range, Schmidt stares at him for a few seconds in an absent-minded way. Then an arm like that of a gorilla shoots out. And the quizzer Untersucher receives a resounding box on the ears to the huge delight of his companions. The old man then permits his iron-lipped mouth to relax into a caustic smile, after which he is left in peace for some time. At the wheel he is an artist, for he seems to divine what the next order is going to be. Or if he is steering her on a course, he predicts the direction of the next wave, even as a skillful chess player works out the moves ahead. I am rather weary and ought to go to bed. But before I lose the savor, I must record the splendid fun I had with Alton at dinner. We were dining alone, as the navigator was on the bridge, and the engineer was busy with a slight leak in the cooking water service. I have said that, though a heavy drinker by nature, Alton is a strict abstainer at sea. Accordingly, I produced a small flask of rum halfway through dinner and helped myself to a liberal tot, placing the liquor between us on the table. As the sight met his eyes and the aroma greeted his nostrils, a gleam of joy flashed across his face, to be succeeded by a frown. With an amiable smile, I proffered the flask to him, remarking at the same time, "You don't drink at sea, do you?" In a thick voice he muttered, "No, yes, no, thank you." With an air of having noticed nothing, I resumed my meal, but out of the corner of my eye, I watched his left hand on the table near the flask. It was most interesting. All the veins stood out like ropes, and his knuckles almost burst through the skin. This went on for about 30 seconds, when he choked out something about needing a breath of fresh air. As he got up, his face was brick red, and I almost thought he'd have a fit. Whether by accident or design, he pulled the cloth as he got out from between the settee and the table, and upset the flask. He was apparently incapable of apologizing, for he rushed up on deck. A few minutes later, the navigating officer came down and asked what was up. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, the captain came up just now, swearing like a trooper, and told me to get to the devil out of it. It didn't seem advisable to question him, so I got out of it and came down. I expressed my opinion that the captain must be feeling seasick, and was ashamed to say so. I also suggested to the navigator that he should take the captain a little brandy, in case he was not feeling well, but the navigator declared he was going to stay down in the warmth till he was sent for. Alton is a great coarse brute. Fancy allowing a material substance, such as alcohol, to grip one's mentality. Thank heaven I have nerves of iron. Nothing would affect me. And now to bed, though I must just read my account of our day in the forest. Darling girl, may I dream of thee. We laid our mines without trouble at 5 a.m. this morning, though at midnight we had a most unpleasant experience. I was asleep, as it was my morning watch, when I was awakened by the harsh rattle of the diving alarms. The diesel subsided with a few spasmodic coughs into silence. And as I jumped out of my bunk and groped for my short sea boots, the navigator and helmsman came tumbling down the conning tower, with the navigator shouting, "Take her down, as hard as you like." The men at the planes had them hard to dive in an instant. The vents had been opened as the hooters sounded, and Alton, who had jumped into the control room, immediately rang down, all out on the electric motors. In 30 seconds from the original alarm, we were at an angle of 20 degrees down by the bow, and I had sat down heavily on the battery boards, completely surprised by the sudden tilt of the deck. It occurred to me that the air was escaping through the vents with a strangely loud noise. But before I could consider the matter further, or even inquire the reason for this sudden dive, the noise increased to a terrifying extent. And whilst I prepared myself for the worst, it culminated into a roar, as of 50 express trains going through a tunnel, mingled with the noise of a high-powered aeroplane engine. The roar drummed and beat and shook the boat, then died away as suddenly as it came. A moment later, there was a severe jar. We had struck the bottom, still maintaining our angle. I painfully got to my feet, and then discovered from the navigator that he had suddenly seen 2 white patches of foam 800 yards on the starboard bow, which resolved themselves into the bow waves of a destroyer approaching at full speed to ram. We had dived just in time, and her knife-edged bow, driven by 30,000 horsepower, had slid through the water a very few feet above our conning tower. Luckily, he had not dropped any depth charges. We were not, however, completely free of our troubles, though we had cheated the destroyer. Examination of the chart showed the bottom to be mud, and on attempting to move the foremost hydroplanes, the plane motor fuses blew out. This showed that the boat was buried in the mud right up to her foremost planes, which were immovable. The hydrophone watchkeeper reported that he could still hear fast-running propellers, though probably some distance away, and as this showed that our old enemy was still nosing about, we were very anxious not to break surface. We just blew A. At least we started to blow A, but Alton wisely decided that, as it was a calm night with a half-moon, the bubbles on the surface might be rather conspicuous. So we stopped the blow and put the pump on. We also flooded W. This had no effect on her at all. We then pumped out Q and P, leaving W full, and adjusted our trim to give her only 3 tons negative buoyancy, just enough to keep us on the bottom if she came out of the mud. In this position, we went full speed astern on the motors, 1,500 amps on each, and all the crew in the after compartment. No result. We then pumped the outer diving tanks on the port side to give her a list to starboard. Still, she remained fixed. So at 2 a.m., we decided to risk it, and we put a slow blow on all tanks. When she had about 50 tons positive buoyancy, she suddenly bucketed up, and as the motors were running full speed astern at the time, we came up and broke surface stern first. In a few seconds, we were trimmed down again, and as a precautionary measure, we proceeded for a couple of miles at 20 meters, when, coming up to periscope depth, we surfaced, and finding all clear, we proceeded. We were put down by a trawler at dawn, though she never saw us. After half an hour's hanging about, she moved off, which was lucky, as she was right on our billet. We are now proceeding to a spot somewhat to the eastward of Cape St. Abs, as we have instructions to do a 2 days patrol here and sink shipping. We ought to start business tomorrow morning. We should be in tonight, then for my little Zoe. But I must record what we have done. Already, I am getting much pleasure from reading my diary. Strange how it amuses one to see little bits of oneself on paper, and the less garnished and franker the truths, the more entertaining it is. The torpedo had jumped clean out of the water, 100 yards short of the steamer, and had then dived under her. We were put down by a trawler at dawn. A moment later, there was a severe jar. We had struck the bottom. The hours here are so long and boring at times that I feel I want to talk intimately with someone. Failing Zoe, I turned to my notebooks. The first steamer we sighted raised high hopes. At least her smoke did. For we saw enough smoke on the horizon to make us think we were to see the Grand Fleet, and we promptly dived. We cruised towards her for about half an hour, and then hung about where we were, as we found that her course would take the ship close to us. As the situation developed, Alton, who was up in the conning tower at the A periscope, gave us a certain amount of information, and we gathered that all this smoke was pouring out of the pipe-stem tunnel of a wretched little English tramp. I found it most irritating, standing in the control room, my action station, and not knowing what was going on. There is only one good job in a submarine, and that is the captain's. He knows and decides everything. The rest of us are in his hands and take things on trust. I object on principle to my life being held in Alton's hands. It is all very well for the crew, for, to start with, they have no imagination, and to most of them, their mental horizon stops at the walls of the boat. Secondly, they have the consolation of mechanical activities. They make and break switches, and open and close valves they work with their hands. An officer has imagination and only works with his head. As we attacked the steamer, all one heard was murmurs from Alton such as, "Raise, lower, take her down to 10 meters, half speed, slow, bring her up to 5 meters, raise, lower." I endeavored to simulate an air of unconcern, which I was far from feeling. Not that I was a prey to physical fear. I flatter myself it is so far unknown to me, and there was no great danger, but simply that I longed to know what was happening. At length, I heard the welcome order. "Starboard tube, stand by," which was followed almost immediately by the order, "Fire." There was a kind of coughing grunt, and the starboard torpedo proceeded on its errand of destruction. Every ear was strained for the sound of the explosion, but all we were vouchsafed was a torrent of blasphemy from Alton. The torpedo had jumped clean out of the water 100 yards short of the steamer, and had then evidently dived under the ship, so I gathered later when Alton had calmed down somewhat. We were about to surface and give her the gun, when luckily Alton took a good sweep round with the skyscraper and discovered one of those wretched little airships about a mile away, coming towards the steamer, which was wailing piteously on her siren. As the chart showed 40 meters, we decided to bottom and have lunch. Over lunch, we discussed the misadventure. Alton was loud in his curses of Tanzerman, the torpedo lieutenant at Bruges, from whom he had got the torpedo in guaranteed good condition only 48 hours before we sailed. He launched forth into a tirade against the torpedo staff at Bruges, and warming to his subject, he roundly abused the whole of the depot personnel, whom he stigmatized as a set of hard-drinking, shore-loafing ruffians, who were incapable of realizing that they existed for the benefit of the boat's personnel and material. I naturally disagreed, and did so the more readily that I conscientiously disagree with him. I find that there is a tendency on the part of some of these submarine officers who have been U-boating a long time to get into narrow grooves. Most reserve officers are not like this, as they have only been in during the war. Alton is an exception. He left the Hamburg America on 2 years' half pay in 1912, and was, of course, kept on in 1914. After all, the depot staff are Germans, and as such labor for the fatherland, and though their work in office and workship is not so dangerous as ours, on the other hand, they have not got the stimulation before their eyes of glory to be gained. Personally, I am of the opinion that the torpedo broke surface because, being fired from the outside tubes. It probably started too shallow, dived deep, recovered shallow and dived deep, broke surface and dived very deep. A sticky motor or sluggish weight would give this effect. And are these external tubes watertight? Theoretically, yes, but what of practice? We have been down to 40 meters several times during this trip, and not once have we had a chance on the surface of getting at the two external tubes. Add to which our depth gear, with the pivots of the weight exposed to water if the tube does flood. And then you have rust, corrosion, and heaven knows what complications. I saw a British Mark 11.50 torpedo at the torpedo shop at Bruges the other day, and I was much struck with their deep depth gear, which is of the unrestrained Uhlin type, i.e., weight and valve interdependent. But then the main feature is that the whole gear is contained in a separate watertight chamber. Our system is certainly a great saving in space, and is much neater in design, whilst I prefer the Uhlin principle of valve conjuncting with weight. But it would be interesting to know whether the British have much trouble with the depth keeping of their torpedo. I have written quite a disquisition on depth gears. I must get on with my record of events. After lunch, we had a good look round, but the small airship was still hanging about, flying slowly in large circles. We were rather surprised to meet one of these despicable little sausages, or Zeppelin's spawn, as the navigator calls them, so far from land. And at dark, we surfaced and proceeded on one engine on an easterly course, charging the battery right up with the other engine. Dawn revealed a blank horizon, not a vestige of mast, funnel, or smoke in sight. We ambled along in fine, though cold, weather, and I took advantage of the peacefulness of everything to do a really good series of Mueller on the upper deck, stripped to the waist, and allowed the keen air to play its invigorating currents on my torso. Alton silently watched me from the conning tower, with a sneering expression on his face. The navigator, who is quite a decent youngster, though of no family, was, I could plainly see, struck by my development, and asked to be initiated into the series of exercises. I agreed willingly enough to show them to him. I will confess, I wish Zoe could have seen me as I perspired with healthy exercise. At about 11 a.m., a couple of masts, then two more, then another, appeared above the horizon. The visibility was extreme, so we at once dived and proceeded at full speed, 10 meters. We had been going thus for perhaps half an hour when Alton remarked that he would have another look at the convoy. We eased speed, came up to 6 meters, and Alton proceeded up into the conning tower to use a periscope. He had hardly applied his eye to the lens when he sharply ordered the boat to 10 meters, accompanying this order with another to the motor room, demanding utmost speed Osserst craft. I went up to the conning tower and found him white with excitement. "Look," he exclaimed, pointing to the periscope, entirely forgetful of the fact that we were at 10 meters. I looked, and of course saw nothing. Furious at the trick I considered he had played on me, I turned on him, to be disarmed by his apology. "Sorry, I forgot. The whole British battle cruiser force is there." It was now my turn to be excited, and I rushed down to the motor room determined to give her every amp she would take. The port foremost motor was sparking like the devil, rings of cursed sparks shooting round the commutator. But this was no time for ceremony. I relentlessly ordered the field current to be still further reduced. We were actually running with an FC of 3.75 amps. For a period, when the sparking assumed the appearance of a ring of fire, and fearing a commutator strip would melt, I ordered an FC of 5 amps. We thus passed a quarter of an hour full of strain, the tension of which was reflected in the attitude of all the men. Alton had announced his intention of using the stern torpedo tube after his failure in the morning. and the crew of this tube were crouched at their stations like a gun's crew in the last few seconds preparatory to opening fire. The switchboard attendants gripped the regulating rheostats as if by their personal efforts they could urge the boat on faster. Old Schmidt at the helm never lifted his eyes from the compass repeater. At length, slow both, bring her to 6 meters, came from the conning tower, to which place I proceeded to hear the news. Slowly the periscope was raised, and I held my breath. A groan came from Alton, and he turned away. For a fraction of a second, I was almost pleased at his obvious pain. Then, sick with disappointment, I took his place. Yes, it was all over. There they were, and with hungry eyes and depressed heart, I saw 5 great battle cruisers, of which I recognized the Tiger with her 3 great funnels, the Princess Royal, Lion, and 2 others, zigzagging along at 25 knots, at a distance of 12,000 meters, across our bow. They were surrounded by a numerous screen of destroyers and light cruisers, the former at that range, through the periscope, appearing as black smudges. It is not often one is permitted such a spectacle in modern war, and I could not tear myself away from the sight of those great brutes, whom I had fought when in the Derflinger at Doggerbank, and again when in the König at Jutland. So near and yet so far, and as they rapidly drew away, so did all the visions of an iron cross. As soon as they were out of sight, we surfaced in order to report what we had seen to Zeebrugge and Heligoland. Everything seemed against us. I had gone on the bridge with the navigator. Alton, with a face as black as hell, had gone to the wardroom. About 10 minutes elapsed when I heard a fearful altercation going on below. I stepped down to find the young wireless operator trembling in front of Alton, who was overwhelming him with a flood of abuse. As I reached the wardroom, Alton shook his fist in the man's face and bellowed, "Make the D thing work, I tell you." "Impossible, Captain, the main condenser," the man began. Purple with rage, Alton seized a heavy pair of parallel rulers, and before I could check him, hurled them full in the operator's face. Bleeding copiously, the youth fell to the deck in a stunned condition. It was then, for the first time, that I noticed a half-empty bottle of spirits on the table, which colossal quantity he must have consumed in about a quarter of an hour. Turning to me, this semi-madman pointed to the wireless operator with his foot and growled, "Have him removed." This I did, and then, lowering the periscope, I ordered the boat to 15 meters. We proceeded at this depth until 8 p.m., when I was informed that the captain was in his bunk and wished to see me. I discovered him with his face to the ship's side, and upon my reporting myself, he ordered me, firstly, to throw that blasted bottle overboard, an unnecessary proceeding, as it was empty, and secondly, to surface and shape course for Zeebrugge. At midnight, he relieved me, apparently perfectly normal. The wireless operator has been laid up all day and has a nasty cut on the head. The navigator, a great scandalmonger, has heard from the engineer that Alton was speaking to him alone this morning, and the engineer believes that Alton has given him 500 marks to say he fell down a hatch. Hore, Blankenberg boy, has just been reported in sight. Soon I shall see my Zoe. With what high hopes did I write the last few lines a few hours ago, and how they were dashed to the ground. For on going into the mess at Bruges, I found amongst my letters a note from her, which was terrible in its brevity. She simply said, "Dear Karl, I am going away for some days, and as I shall be traveling, it is no good giving you an address. To our next meeting. Zoe." How horribly vague, not an indication of her destination, her object, or the probable length of her absence. Of course, I rushed round to the flat, but found the place shut up. The porter told me she had gone away with her maid. He couldn't say when she'd be back, if at all. I gave him 10 marks, and he said she might be away a fortnight. If I'd given him 20, he'd have said a week, He obviously didn't know. I feel I could do anything tonight. Any mad, evil thing would appeal to me. There is a most fearful uproar coming from the guest room, where a large and rowdy party are entertaining the chorus of a traveling review company. I saw them when they arrived, horribly common-looking women with legs like mine tubes. Another day and still no news. I don't know how I shall stick it. She might have had the softness of heart to write to me. She knows my address. This evening, a letter from the little mother, who asks whether I can find time to go to Frankfurt when I have leave. At the end of the letter, she mentions that Rosa has joined the Women's Voluntary Auxiliary Corps of Army Nurses. I suppose she thought she'd like her photograph taken in some fancy uniform as Rosa Frainland, one of our Frankfurt beauties, now on war work. Holding the patient's hand is about the only work she intends doing. Women as a class are the same the world over. We are well supplied with English papers in the mess here. They come regularly from Amsterdam, and in their pages I see, just as in ours, pictures of the Countess this and the Lord that, photographed in becoming attitudes doing war work. It seems agricultural pursuits are the fashion in England at present. Wait till our U-boat war gets its knife well into their fat guts. It will be more than fashionable to work in the fields then. The British Empire is undeniably a great creation, or rather not so much a creation as a thing arrived at accidentally, but it lacks solidarity. It sprawls, a confused mass of races and creeds, around the world. Its very immensity lays it open to attack. It has a dozen Achilles' heels from Ireland to Egypt and South Africa to India. I met a man only yesterday who was recently at the propaganda department of the Foreign Office. And without going into details, he gave me a very good idea of the good work that is going on in Britain's canker spots. Ireland is considered particularly promising to those in the know. Now for an agitated night, to think that a girl should disturb me so. 2 days have passed, or rather, dragged their interminable lengths away, for there is still not a vestige of news. I have been twice to the flat with no result, except to receive a piece of impertinence from the porter the last time I was there. No news. Still no news, and we sail in 48 hours. At sea off the Isle of Wight. It is some days since I turned for solace and enjoyment, amidst the discomforts of this life, to my pen and notebook. What strange tricks fate plays with us, and how lucky it is that one cannot foresee the future. Here I am in U.39, but I must start at the beginning. My last entry was the depressing one of still no news. Well, I have had news, but it was like a drop of water in the mouth of a parched-up man. Another agonizing 24 hours passed, and I was sitting in my room about 10 o'clock, trying to resign myself to the idea that the next night I should be starting out for my third trip without news of her, when the telephone bell rang. I lifted the receiver, and to my amazed joy heard a voice that I could have recognized in 1,000. It was Zoe. I was quite incapable of any remark, and my confusion was further increased when, after a few hellos, which I idiotically repeated, her clear, level tone said, "Is that you, Karl? How are you?" How was I? What a question to ask. I wanted to tell her that I was bubbling with joy, that 1,000-kilogram load had been lifted from my chest, that my blood was coursing through my veins, that I, usually so cool, was trembling with excitement, that I could have kissed the mouthpiece of the humble instrument that linked us together. Yet I was quite incapable of answering her simple question. I can't imagine what I expected her to say, for upon reflection, her remark was a very ordinary one, and indeed, under the circumstances, quite natural. But, as I say, in actual fact, I was tongue-tied. I suppose I must have said something, for I next remember her saying, "Well, you might ask how I am." And to my horror, I realized that she thought I was being rude. My abject apologies were cut short by her tantalizing laugh, and I understood that the adorable one was teasing me. When at length I made myself believe that I really was talking to this most elusive and delightful woman, I wasted no time in suggesting that, late though it was, I might be permitted to go round and see her. She would not permit this, as she said it would create grave scandal, and the colonel might hear about it upon his return. I pleaded hard and urged my departure in 24 hours. She was firm and reproved me for discussing movements over the telephone. She was right. I was a fool to do so, but Zoe destroys all my caution. However, she said that I might lunch with her next day and that she had some new music to play to me. I ventured to ask where she had been, but this question was plainly unpleasing to my lady, so I dropped the subject. I blew her a good-night kiss over the telephone, to which I think I caught an answer. And then she rang off. 10 minutes had not elapsed when a messenger entered and informed me that I was wanted at the Commodore's office at once. A strange feeling of uneasiness, and that of impending misfortune, overcame me. I felt like a naughty schoolboy about to interview the headmaster. I followed the messenger into the Commodore's office and found myself alone with the great man. He was seated at a huge roll-top desk, which was the only article of furniture in a room which was to all intents and purposes papered with large-scale charts of the east and south coasts of England, and of the Channel and North Sea. The Commodore was sealing an envelope as I came in. He looked up and saw me. Then, without taking any further notice of me, he resumed his business with the envelope. I felt that I was in the presence of a personality, and I was, for Old Man Max is one of the 10 men who count in the naval administration. He had a reading lamp on his desk, and I remember noticing that the light shining through its green shade imparted a yellow parchment-like effect to the top of his old bald head. With dainty care, he finished sealing the envelope. Then, picking up a telephone transmitter, he snapped admirably. In about a minute he was connected, and to my astonishment, I realized that he was talking to the duty captain of the operations department in Berlin. His words chilled my heart, for he said, "Commodore speaking. U.39 sails at 2 a.m. for Operation FQH. Repeat." His words were apparently repeated to his satisfaction, for while I was vainly endeavoring to convince myself that I was unconnected with the sailing of U.39, he banged the receiver into place. Old Man Max does everything in bangs, and snapped at me. "You Lieutenant von Schenk." I admitted I was, and then heard this disgusting news. Krantz, First Lieutenant U.39, reported suddenly ill, Zeebrugge. Poisoning you relieve him. Ship sails in 1 hour 40 minutes from now. My car leaves here in 40 minutes and takes you to Zeebrugge. Here are operation orders. Inform von Weissman. He acknowledges receipt direct to me on phone. That's all. He handed me the envelope, and I suppose I walked outside at least. I found myself in the corridor, turning the confounded envelope round and round. For one mad moment, I felt like rushing in and saying, "But, sir, you don't understand I'm lunching with Zoe tomorrow." Then the mental picture which this idea conjured up made me shake with suppressed laughter. And I remembered that war was war, and that I had only 35 minutes in which to collect such gear, as I had handy most of my sea things being in UC.47, and say goodbye to Zoe. I ran to my room and made the corridors echo with shouts for my faithful Adolf. The excellent man was soon on the scene, and whilst he stuffed underclothing, towels, and other necessary gear into a bag he had purloined from someone's room, I rang up Zoe. I wasted 10 minutes getting through, but at last I heard a deliciously sleepy voice murmur, "Who's that?" I told her and added that I was off. To my secret joy, an intensely disappointed and long-drawn ooh-oh came over the wire. So she does care a bit, I thought. Mad ideas of pretending to be suddenly ill crossed my mind, anything to gain 24 hours, but the fatherland is above all such considerations. And after some pleasant talk and many wishes of good luck from the darling girl, with a heavy heart I bade her good night. The old man's car, which is a 60-horsepower Benz, was waiting at the mess entrance, and once clear of the sentries, we raced down the flat, well-metalled road to Zeebrugge in a very short time. The guard at Bruges barrier had phoned us through to the Zeebrugge fortified zone, and we were admitted without delay. In 3/4 of an hour from my interview with old Max, I was scrambling across a row of U-boats to reach my new ship, U.39. I went down the after hatch, reported myself to von Weissman, and delivered his orders to him, of which he acknowledged receipt direct to the Commodore according to instructions. Von Weissman is a very different stamp of man to Alton. Of medium height, he has sandy-colored hair, steel-gray eyes, and a protruding jaw. He is what he looks, a fine North Prussian, and is, of course, of excellent family. As the Weissmans had been settled in Greinitz for a long period. He struck me as being about 30 years of age, and on his heart he wore the cross of the 2nd class. I have heard of him before as being well in the running towards an order pour le Mayrite. An interesting chart is hanging in the wardroom, on which is marked the last resting place of every ship he has sunk. He puts a colored dot, the tint of which varies with the tonnage, black up to 2,000, blue from 2,000 to 5,000, brown 5,000 to 8,000, green 8,000 to 11,000, and a red spot with the ship's name for anything over 11,000. He has got about 120,000 tons at present. He opposes the Arnauld de la Perrière school of thought, which pins faith on the gun, and Weissman has done nearly all his work with the good old torpedo. Altogether, undoubtedly a man to serve with. The U.39 was in that buzzing and semi-active condition, which to a trained eye is a sure indication that the ship is about to sail. Punctually at 5 minutes to 2 a.m. Weissman went to the bridge, and at 2 a.m. the wires were slipped, and we started on a 10 days trip. As the dim lights on the mole disappeared, and the ceaseless fountain of star shells, mingling with the flashing of guns, rose inland on our port beam, my mind traveled overland to the flat at Bruges, and I wondered whether Zoe was lying awake, listening to the ceaseless rumble of the Flanders cannon. We went on at full speed, as it was our intention to pass the Dover Straits before dawn. Though our intelligence bureau issues the most alarming reports as to the frightfulness of the defenses here, I was agreeably surprised at the ease with which we passed. Von Weissman, to whom I had hinted that we might find the passage tricky, rather laughed at my suggestion, and described to me his method, which, at all events, has the merit of simplicity. He always goes through with the tide, so as to take as short a time as possible, and he always decides on a course, and steers it as closely as possible, keeping to the surface unless he sights anything, and diving as soon as anything shows up. Even if he dives, he goes on as fast as possible on his course, irrespective of whether he is being bombed or not. I must say it worked very well last night. We shaped a course to pass 5 miles west of Grisnez, and when that light, which for some reason the French had commodiously lit that night, was a beam, we sighted a black object, probably a trawler or destroyer, about 6 miles away right ahead. Weissman immediately dived, and without deviating a degree from his course, held on at 3/4 speed on the motors. Some time later, the hydrophone watchkeeper reported the sound of propellers in his listeners. and that he judged them to be close at hand. So I imagine we passed very nearly directly underneath whatever it was. After an hour submerging, we rose and found dawn breaking over a leaden and choppy sea. Nothing being in sight, we continued on the surface for an hour, charging batteries with the starboard engine, 500 amps on each. But at 9 a.m., the clouds lying low and an aerial patrol being frequent hereabouts, we dived and cruised steadily down channel at slow speed, keeping periscope depth. Several times in the course of the forenoon, we sighted small destroyers and convoy craft in the distance, all steering westerly. They were probably returning from escorting troopships over to France last night. In every case, we went to 60 feet long before they could have seen our stick. Weissman is evidently as cautious in this matter as he is hardy in others. The more I see of him, the more I like him. He is a man of breeding, and it is of value to serve in this boat. As I write, we are on the surface, about 10 miles east of the Isle of Wight, still steering down channel. Tonight at midnight, we report our position to Zeebrugge. Up till now, we have maintained wireless silence for fear of the British and French directional stations picking up our signals and fixing our position. After supper this evening, von Weissman explained to me the general plan of our operations for the next 8 days. Our cruising billet is about 150 miles southwest of the Scillies, at the focal point where trade for Liverpool and Bristol and the up-channel trade diverges. Von Weissman says that this is a plumb billet and we should do well. I feel this is going to be better than those piffling little mine-laying trips. And though we shall be away 10 days, it will qualify me for 4 days' leave in Belgium. There was nearly an awkward moment last night, or rather, there was an awkward moment and nearly an awkward accident. I relieved the navigator at midnight. The pilot is an unassuming individual called Siegel, and took on the middle watch. It was blowing about force 4 from the southwest, and a nasty short, lumpy sea was running, which caught us just on the port bow. About once every 10 seconds she missed her step with the waves and, dipping her nose into it, shoveled up tons of water, which, as the bow lifted, raced aft and breaking against the gun, flung itself in clouds of spray against the bridge. In a very few minutes, every exposed portion of me was streaming with water. At about 2 a.m., I had turned my back to the sea for a moment, and my thoughts were for an instant in Bruges, when, on facing forward once again, I saw a sight which effectually brought me back to earth. This was the spectacle of 2 black shapes, evidently steamers, one on either bow, distant, I should estimate, 600 or 700 meters. I had to make a quick decision, and I decided that to fire a torpedo in that sea with any hope of a hit, especially with the boat on surface, was useless. Furthermore, that at any moment either of the steamers might sight us from their high bridge and turn and ram. These thoughts were the work of an instant, and I at once rang the diving bell and pushing the lookout before me. In 5 seconds I was in the conning tower and had the hatch down. I at once proceeded down into the boat, and the first thing that struck my eye was the diving gauge with the needle practically stationary at 2 meters. The boat was not going down properly, and for an instant I was rudely shaken until a cool voice from the wardroom remarked, "Helm hard a port," an order that was instantly obeyed, and as she began to turn the moving needle on the depth gauge, began its journey round the dial. It was the captain who had spoken. As soon as he heard the diving alarm, he was out of his bunk, and a glance at the gauge he has fitted in the wardroom told him we were not sinking rapidly. In an instant, he had put his finger on the trouble, which was that we were almost head-on to the sea, with the result that he had given the order as stated above, which, bringing us beam on to the sea, had caused her to dive with ease. He is efficiency itself. As I explained to him what had happened, the noise of propellers at varying distances from us overhead led him to state his belief that we had run into a convoy homeward bound to Southampton from the Atlantic. He approved of my actions in every particular, save only in my omission to bring the boat away from the sea as I began to dive. This morning, we are beginning to get the full force of what is evidently going to be a southwesterly gale of some violence. The seas are getting larger as we debouch into the Atlantic. This looks bad for business. At the moment, we are practically hove to on the surface, with the port engine just jogging to keep her head on to sea, and the starboard ticking round to give her a long, slow charge of 200 amps. The wind is force 7 to 8, and a very big sea is running, which makes it entirely impossible to open the conning tower hatch. The engine is getting its air through the special mushroom ventilator, which is apparently not designed to supply both the boat's requirements and those of the engine. The whole ventilator gets covered with sea every now and then, during which period, until the baffled drains get the water away, no air can get in. So the engine has a good suck at the air in the boat, the result of all this being a slight vacuum in the boat. It is a very unpleasant sensation and made me very sick. This is really a form of sickness due to the rarefied air. I had a great surprise when I looked at the barograph this morning, as the needle had gone right off the paper at the bottom. And at first glance, I thought we had struck a tropical depression of the first magnitude, which, flouting all the laws of meteorology, had somehow found its way to the English Channel. But the engineer explained to me that, as I have already stated, the low atmospheric pressure in the boat was due to the conning tower hatch being shut down. As the dim lights on the mole disappeared, the ceaseless fountain of star shells mingling with the flashing of guns rose inland on our port beam. We hit her aft for the second time. I have discovered that von Weissman is a martyr to seasickness all day. He has been lying down as white as a sheet and subsisting on milk tablets and sips of brandy. Yet such is the man's inflexibility of will that he forces himself to make a tour of inspection right round the boat every 6 hours, night and day. It is this will to conquer which has made Germans unconquerable, though come the four corners of the world in arms against us. As the great poet says, we are, of course, keeping watch from inside the conning tower. It is, at all events, dry, but as to seeing anything, one might as well be looking out through a small glass window from inside a breakwater. To bed till 4 a.m. A most unprofitable day. I grudge every day away from Zoe on which we do nothing. This morning about noon the gale blew itself out, but a heavy confused sea continued to run. At 2 p.m. we saw a most tantalizing spectacle. A big tank steamer, fully 600 feet long and of probably 17,000 tons, burthen hove in sight, escorted by 2 destroyers. To attack with the gun was impossible, as we could only keep the conning tower open when stern to sea, and in any case the 2 destroyers prevented any surface work. We tried to get in for an attack, but we had not seen her in time, and the best we could do was to get within 3,000 yards, at which range it would have been absurd to have wasted a torpedo, the chances of hitting being 100 to 1 against, even if the torpedo had run properly in the sea that was on. I had a good look at her through the foremost periscope in between the waves, and it maddened me to see all that oil, doubtless from Tampico for the Grand Fleet, going safely by. The destroyers were having a bad time of it, crashing into the sea like porpoises, their funnels white with salt, and their bridges enveloped in sheets of water and spray. They little thought that, barely a mile away, amidst the tumbling, crested waves, a German eye was watching them. There is no doubt these damned British have pluck, for it was the last sort of weather in which one would have expected to find destroyers at sea, and yet I suppose they do this throughout the winter. After all, one would expect them to be tough fellows, They are of Teutonic stock, though by their bearing one might imagine that the Creator made an Englishman, and then Adam. Let's hope we get some decent weather tomorrow. I have just been refreshing my memory by reading of what I wrote in the book concerning the day in the forest with the adorable girl. There is an exquisite pleasure in transporting the mind into such memories of the past when the body is in such surroundings as the present. If only I could will myself to dream of her. A fine day in every sense of the word. The weather has been and remains excellent, and I have been present at my first sinking. It was absurdly commonplace. At 10 a.m. this morning, a column of smoke crept upwards from the southern horizon. Von Weissman steered towards it on the surface until 2 masts and the top of a funnel appeared. We dived and proceeded slowly underwater on a southerly course. Half an hour passed, and von Weissman brought the boat up to periscope depth and had a look. He called to me to come and see, an invitation I accepted with alacrity. With natural excitement, I looked through the periscope, and there she was, unconsciously ambling to her doom like a fat sheep. She was a steamer, British, of about 4,000 tons, slugging home at a steady 10 knots. But she was destined to come to her last mooring place ahead of schedule time. We dipped our periscope, and I went forward to the tubes. 5 minutes elapsed, and the order instrument bell rang, the pointer flicking to stand by. I personally removed the firing gear safety pin and put the repeat to ready. A breathless pause, then a slight shake and destruction was on its way, whilst I realized by the angle of the boat that Weissman was taking us down a few meters. That shows his coolness. He didn't even trouble to watch his shot. Anxiously, I watched the second hand of my stopwatch. Weissman had told me the range would be about 500 meters, 30 seconds, 31, 32, 33. Has he missed? 34, 35, 3. A dull rumble comes through the water, and the whole boat shakes. Hurrah, we have hit, and the order surface comes along the voice pipe. The cheerful voice of the blower is heard, evacuating the tanks. I run to the conning tower and closely follow Weissman up the ladder. At last, I am on the bridge. There she is. What a sight. I feel that I shall never forget what she looked like. Though, if all goes well, I shall see many another fine ship go to her grave. But she was my first. I felt the same sensation when, as a boy, I shot my first roe deer in the Black Forest. One instant a living thing beautiful to perfection. The next my rifle spoke, and a bleeding carcase lay beneath the fine trees. So with this ship. I am a sailor, and to every sailor every ship that floats has, as it were, a soul, a personality, an entity. To carry the analogy further, a merchant craft is like some fat beast of utility, an ox, a cow, or a sheep, whilst a warship is a lion if she is a battleship, a leopard if she is a light cruiser, etc. In all cases worthy game. But war has little use for sentimentality. And in my usual wandering manner, I see that I have meandered from the point, and quite forgotten what she did look like. What I saw was this. I saw that the steamer had been hit forward on the starboard side. The upper portion of the stem piece was almost down to the water level. Her foremost hold was obviously filling rapidly. Her stern was high out of water, the red ensign of England flapping impotently on the ensign staff. Her propeller, which was still slowly revolving, thrashed the water. And this heightened the impression that I was watching the struggles of a dying animal. The propeller was revolving in spasmodic jerks, due, I imagine, to the fast failing steam only forcing the cranks over their dead centers with an effort. A boat was being lowered with haste from the 2 davits abreast the funnel on one side, but when she was full of men, and due to the angle of the ship, well down by the bow, someone inboard let go the foremost fall or else it broke. For the bows of the boat fell downwards, and half a dozen figures were projected in grotesque attitudes into the sea. For a few seconds, the boat swung backwards and forwards like a pendulum. When she came to rest, hanging vertically downwards from the stern, I noticed that a few men were still clinging like flies to her thwarts. Truly, anything is better than the Atlantic in winter. Meanwhile, the ship had ceased to sink as far as outward signs went. I mentioned this to von Weissman, who was at my side with a slight smile on his face, amused doubtless at the eagerness with which I watched every detail of this, to me, novel tragedy. He answered me that I need not worry, that she was being supported by an air lock somewhere forward, that the water was slowly creeping into her, and her boilers would probably soon go. This remarkable man was absolutely correct. There was an interval of about 5 minutes, during which another boat, evidently successfully lowered from the other side, came round her stern, picked up 1 or 2 men from the water, and also collected the survivors in the hanging boat. Then the steamer suddenly sank another 2 feet. There was a dull rumbling, as of heavy machinery falling from a height, a muffled report, a cloud of steam and smoke, a sucking noise, and then a pool in the water, in the middle of which odd bits of wood and other buoyant debris kept on bobbing up. Nothing else. No, I am wrong. There were 2 other things. A U-boat, representing the might of Germany, and a whaler with perhaps 20 men in it, representing the plight of England. As she went, I felt hushed and solemn. It was an impressive moment. A slight chuckle came from imperturbable Weissman. He had seen too many go to think much of it, and he gave an order for the helm to be put over, so that we might approach the whaler. They were horribly overcrowded, and were engaged in trying to sort themselves into some sort of order. We passed by them at 50 yards, and Weissman, seizing his megaphone, shouted in English, "Goodbye, steer west for America." A cold horror gripped my heart. It was an awful moment. I dare not write the thoughts that entered my head. I turned away my head and faced aft, that he should not see my face. Looking back, I saw the whaler rocking dangerously in our wash, and then a commotion took place in her stern, from which a huge, bearded man arose, and shaking his fist in our direction, shouted something or other before his companions pulled him down. Von Weissman heard, and his lips narrowed in. I held my breath in suspense, but he evidently decided against what he had been about to do, for with the order, "Course north," 10 knots, he went below. I remained on deck, watching the rapidly receding whaler through my glasses, until she was a mere speck alone on the ocean, 150 miles from land. Then the navigator came up, and with strangely mixed feelings of exultant joy and depressing sorrow, I went below. Von Weissman was in the wardroom. I watched him unobserved. He was humming a tune to himself and had just completed putting a green dot on the chart. This done, he lay back on the settee and closed his eyes, strange, insoluble man. For long hours I could not forget that whaler. I see it now as I write. I suppose I shall get used to it all. What would Zoe say? The most wonderful thing about man is that he can stand the strain of his own invention of modern war. I am rather tired tonight, but must just jot down briefly what has taken place today, as there is never any time in the daylight hours. Soon after dawn, at about 8 a.m., we sighted a fair-sized steamer of about 3,000 tons, which we sunk, but I cannot say what she looked like, or whether anyone escaped, as we never came to the surface at all, von Weissman sighting smoke on the western horizon just as he hit her. We accordingly steered in that direction. However, I think she went almost at once, as von Weissman put a dot black on the chart as we made towards number 3. I very much wanted to know whether there were any survivors, but I did not like to ask him at the time, and he has been in such an infernal temper ever since that I haven't had a suitable opportunity. The cause of his rage was as follows. Steamer number 3 turned out to be a fine fat chap of the clan line, von Weissman said, when we first sighted her. We moved in to attack and fired our port bow tube. I waited in vain by the tubes for the expected explosion. Nothing happened, but after a couple of minutes, a snarl came down the voice pipe. Surface, gun action stations. I ran aft and found the captain white with rage. Missed ahead, he said with intense feeling. I'll have to use that confounded gun. In about 3 minutes, the captain and myself were on the bridge, and the crew were at their stations round the gun. For the first time I saw the ship. She was stern on and apparently painted with black and white stripes. As I examined her through glasses, she was distant about 3,000 yards. I saw a flash aboard her, and a few seconds later a projectile moaned overhead and fell about 6,000 yards over. So she is armed, thought I, and she has actually opened fire on us first. The effect of this unexpected retort on the part of the Englishman was to throw Weissman into a paroxysm of rage. "Why don't you fire? What the devil are you waiting for?" etc., etc., were some of the remarks he flung at the gun crew. I did not consider it advisable to mention to him that they were probably waiting his order to fire, and also his orders for range and deflection, as I had imagined that, here as everywhere else, an officer controls the gunfire. Apparently in this boat, it is not so, as Weissman takes so little interest in his gun that he affects to be, or else actually is, ignorant of the elements of gun control. At any rate, under the lash of his tongue, the gun's crew soon got into action, the gun layer taking charge. Our first shot was short, very considerably so, as was also the second. Meanwhile, the steamer had been keeping up a very creditably controlled rate of fire, straddling us twice, but missing for deflection, as was natural considering that we were bows onto her. I felt thoroughly in my element, listening to the significant wail of the enemy's shell, punctuated by the ear-splitting report of our own gun. Weissman, gripping the rail with both hands, and to my surprise ducking when one went overhead, watched the target with a fixed expression, but made no attempt to control our gunfire, which was far from creditable, as is inevitable when it is left to the mercy of the inferior intellect of a seaman. However, at the 10th or 11th round, we hit her in the upper works, as was shown by a bright red and yellow flash near her funnel. This did not check her firing or speed in the least. In fact, she seemed to be gaining on us. She also began to zigzag slightly and throw smoke bombs overboard, which were not so effective from her point of view as I had thought they would be. Matters were thus for some minutes. We had just hit her aft for the second time, though the shooting was so disgustingly bad that I was about to ask whether I might do the duties of control officer, when there was a blinding flash, and the air seemed filled with moaning fragments. When I had recovered from my relief from finding that I was personally uninjured, I observed that 2 of the gun's crew were wounded, and 1 was lying, either killed or seriously wounded, on the casing. We had been hit in the casing, well forward, and as was subsequently proved when we dived, little material damage was caused to the boat. This enemy success caused a temporary cessation of fire. The 2 wounded men were cautiously making their way aft to the conning tower, and I called for a couple of stokers to come up and carry away the 3rd, when von Weissman suddenly gave the order to dive. The gun's crew at once made a rush for the conning tower, and were down the hatch in a trice, one of the wounded men fainting at the bottom. I was unaware as to the reason of this order to dive, and thought that perhaps the captain had sighted a periscope. As I was turning to precede him down the conning tower hatch, I distinctly saw the man lying by the gun lift his hand. I felt I could not leave him there, and instinctively cried, "He is still alive." But von Weissman, who was urging the crew to hurry down the hatch, pressed the diving alarm as soon as the last sailor was half in the hatch. I knew that this meant that the boat would be under in 30 to 40 seconds, so I had no alternative but to get down the hatch as quickly as possible. I did so with reluctance, and I was followed by von Weissman, who joined me in the upper conning tower. I forced myself not to look out of the conning tower scuttles during the few seconds that elapsed as the casing slowly went under, until at last nothing but waving green water showed at each little window. I feared that, if I had looked, I would have seen a wounded man, stung into activity by the cold touch of the Atlantic. Perhaps von Weissman read my thoughts, or else he remembered my remark concerning the man. For he turned to me and in level tones said, "Have you any doubt that he was dead?" I hesitated a moment, and he continued, "By my direction you have no doubt. He was. How brutal war is, and what a perfect exponent of the art the captain proves himself to be. To me a life is a life, a particle of the thing divine. To him, a life is a unit, and a half-maimed and probably dying seaman is as nothing in the scales when the safety of a U-boat is at stake. The seamen are numbered in their tens of thousands, the U-boats in their tens. The steamer had hit us once, luckily only in the casing. A second hit might well have punctured the pressure hull, and our fate in these waters would have been certain. Therefore, having summed these things up and balanced them in his mind, he dived, and the sailor died. Once below water, von Weissman seemed more his imperturbable self, and unless I am mistaken, he is never really happy on the surface, at least when in action. He is a true water mole. A day full of interest, though once again I have had to force myself to absorb the horrors of war. I imagine that I am now going through the experiences of a new arrival on the Western Front, who feels a desire to shudder at the sight of every corpse. At 10 a.m. this morning, we sighted the topsails of a sailing boat to the southwest. Closing her on the surface, we approached to within about 6,000 meters, when suddenly von Weissman ordered gun action stations. The gun crew came tumbling up, but not quick enough to suit him. For as they were mustering at the gun, he gave the order to dive, only, however, taking her down to periscope depth before instantly ordering surface, and then gun action stations again. This time we opened fire on the ship, which was a Norwegian bark, and being in the barred zone, liable to destruction. Von Weissman had announced overnight that at the first opportunity he would give that guns crew a bellyful of practice, and he certainly did. As soon as the first shot was fired, she backed her topsails, and when our fourth shot struck her, somewhere near the foot of the foremast, her crew could be seen hastily abandoning their ship. This action on their part had no influence with von Weissman, who had taken personal charge of the helm, and with the engines running at 3/4 speed, he was zigzagging about to make it harder for the gun's crew. Every now and then he flung a jibe at the crew, such as suggesting that they should go back to the high seas fleet and learn how to shoot. The sailing ship was soon on fire, for considering the circumstances, the shooting was very fair, though had I been controlling it, I could have confidently guaranteed better results. When she was blazing nicely fore and aft, von Weissman ordered the practice to cease and sent the crew below. He then ordered course south, speed 10 knots, and I took over the watch. An hour and a half later, when the navigator gave me a spell, a black cloud on the northern horizon marked the funeral pyre of another of our victims. When I went below, the captain had just finished playing with his precious old chart. We received a message at 2 a.m. last night from Heligoland to return forthwith. It is now 2 a.m., and we are approaching the redoubtable Dover Barrage. We had no trouble coming up channel today, which seems singularly empty, at any rate in mid-channel, where we were. We got back about 3 hours ago, and as I was appointed temporary to the boat, Von Weissman kindly allowed me to leave her and come up to Bruges as soon as we got into the shelters at Zeebrugge. I got up here just in time for a late dinner. Hunger satisfied, I retired to my room and, needless to say, at once rang up my darling Zoe. By the mercy of Providence, she was in. But imagine my sensations when I heard that accursed swine of a colonel was also back from the front, and expected in at the flat at any moment, being then, she thought, engaged in his after-dinner drinking bouts at the Cavalry Officers' Club. I could only groan. A laugh at the other end stung me to furious rage, appeased in an instant by her soothing tones as she told me that I should be glad to hear that he was only up from the Somme on a 4 days' leave, and was returning next morning by the 8 a.m. troop train. Glad, I could have danced for joy. I breathed again. As the colonel was expected back at any moment, she thought it advisable to terminate the conversation, which was done with obvious reluctance on her part. Or so I flatter myself. He goes tomorrow, so far so good. But what of the intervening period? Could any more refined torture be imagined than that I, who love her as I love my own soul, should have to sit here, whilst scarcely a mile away, probably at this very moment as I write, that gross brute is privileged to kiss her, to look at her, it's unbearable. When I think of that hog, for though I've never seen him, I've seen his photograph, and I know instinctively that he is gross, fresh. As she says, from a drinking bout, should at this moment be permitted to raise his pig's eyes and look into those glorious wells of violet light. When I think that his is the privilege to see those masses of black hair fall in uncontrolled splendor, then I understand to the full the deep pleasures of murder. I would give anything to destroy this man, and could shake the Englishman by the hand who fires the delivering bullet. Steady, steady, what do I write? No, I mean it, every word of it. Yet of all the mysteries, and to me Zoe is a mass of them, surely the strangest of all is contained in the question. Why does she live with him? She doesn't love him, she's practically told me so. In fact, I know she doesn't. Let me reason it out by logic. She lives with him, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. Suppose it be voluntarily, then her reasons must be A, love, B, fascination, C, some secret reason. If she is living with him involuntarily, it must be D, he has a hold on her, E, for financial reasons. I strike out at once A and E, for in the case of E, she knows well that I would provide for her, and A I refuse to admit. B is hardly credible, I eliminate that. I am left with C and D, which might be the same thing. But what hold can he have on her? She can't have a past. She is too young and sweet for that. I must find out about this before I go to sea again. 3 days ago, I was racking my brains for the solution of a problem, and as I see from what I wrote, I was somewhat outside myself. In the interval, things have taken an amazing turn. I am still bewildered, but I must put it all down from the beginning. The colonel left as she said he would, and I went round to lunch with her. We had a delightful tete-a-tete, and after lunch she played the piano. I was feeling in splendid voice, and she accompanied me to perfection in Tchaikovsky's, To the Forest, always a favorite of mine. As the last chords died away, Zoe jumped up from the piano, and with eyes dancing with excitement, placed her hands on my shoulders and exclaimed, "Karl, I have an idea. I shall make a prisoner of you for 2 or 3 days." I laughed heartily, and almost told her that she had already made me a prisoner for life. Only I can never get those sort of remarks out quick enough. But when she said, "No, I am not joking, I mean it," I felt there was more meaning in her sentence than I had at first thought. I begged to be enlightened, and she then unfolded her scheme. She told me for the first time that in a forest not far from Bruges she had a little summer house, to which she used to retreat for weekends in the hot weather when the colonel was away. He knew nothing of this country house. She was very insistent on that point. So I imagined she paid for it out of her dress allowance, or in some other way. The idea that had just struck her was that she had a sudden fancy to go and spend 2 days there. And I was to go with her. I was ready to go to Africa with her if my leave permitted. And it so happened that I was due for 4 days overseas leave, limited to Belgian territory. So that this fitted in very well, and I told her so. She was delighted then, with one of those quick intuitions which women are so clever at. She read the half-formed thought in my mind and said, "You mustn't think it's not going to be conventional. Old Babette will be with us to chaperone me." Old Babette is an aged female whom she calls her maid. I think she is jealous of me. I agreed at once that, of course, I quite understood it was to be highly conventional, etc. Though I smiled to myself as I visualized my mother's shocked face and uplifted hands had she heard my Zoe's ideas on the conventions. I was trying to fathom what was at the bottom of it all when she remarked, "Of course, as my prisoner you will have to obey all my orders." I replied that this was certainly so. "And one of the first things," she continued, "that happens to a prisoner when he goes through the enemy lines is that he is blindfolded. And in the same way, I shan't let you know where you are going." Seeing a doubtful look in my eyes as I endeavored to keep pace with the underlying idea, if any, of this truly feminine fancy, she suddenly came up to me and, lifting her eyes to mine, murmured, "Don't you trust me?" In a moment, my passion flared up and rained hot kisses on her face as she struggled to release herself from my arms. When I left that night after dinner and, walking on air, returned to the mess, it was arranged that I should be at her flat with my suitcase at 6 p.m. the next evening, prepared, to use her own words, to disappear with me for 48 hours. She had told me of an address in Bruges which she said would forward on any telegram if I was recalled, and I had to be satisfied with that. For I may as well say here that I never discovered where I went to, and I don't know to this moment in what part of Belgium I spent the last 2 nights. I tried to find out at first, but as she obviously attached some importance to keeping the locality of her woodland retreat a secret, probably to circumvent the colonel, I soon gave up trying to get the secret from her and contented myself with taking things as they came. To go on with my account of what happened, which was really so remarkable that I propose writing it out in detail to the best of my memory at 6 p.m. next day. I was naturally at her flat, feeling very much as if I was on the threshold of an adventure. Zoe was excited, and the flat was in a turmoil, as apparently she had only just begun to pack her dressing case. Soon after 6, we went down and got into a large Mercedes car which I had noticed standing outside when I arrived. We were soon on our way and left Bruges by the eastern barrier. We showed our passes and proceeded into the darkened countryside. We had been running for about a mile when she remarked, "Prisoners will now be blindfolded," and, to my astonishment, slipped a little black silk bag over my head. I was so startled I didn't know whether to be angry or to laugh or what to do. Eventually I did nothing, and, entering into the spirit of the game, declared that even a wretched prisoner had the right not to be stifled, whereupon she lifted the lower portion of the bag and uncovered my mouth. Shortly afterwards, I was electrified to feel a pair of soft lips meet mine, a sensation which was repeated at frequent intervals, and, as I whispered in her ear, under these conditions, I was prepared to be taken prisoner into the jaws of hell. This pleasant journey had lasted for about 3/4 of an hour when my mask was removed, and I was informed that I was inside the enemy lines. Through the windows of the car, I could dimly see that an apparently endless mass of fir trees were rushing past on each side. This state of affairs continued for a kilometer or so, when we branched to the right and soon entered a large clearing in the forest, at one side of which stood the house. Babette, Zoe, and myself entered the building, and the car disappeared, presumably back to Bruges. The house, built of logs, was of 2 stories. On the ground floor were 2 living rooms and the domains of Babette, who amongst her other accomplishments turned out to be not only a most capable valet, but a first-class cook. On the 2nd story, there were 2 large rooms. The whole house was furnished after the manner of a hunting lodge, with stags' heads on the walls and skins on the floors. In the drawing room, there was a piano and a few etchings of the Wild Boar by Schaffy. I dressed for dinner in my smoking, though under ordinary circumstances I should have considered this rather formal. But I was glad I did, for she appeared in full evening tenue. She wore a violet gown, and across her forehead a black satin bandeau with a Z in diamonds upon it. It must have cost 2,000 marks, and I wondered with a dull kind of jealousy whether the colonel had given it to her. I cannot remember of what we talked during dinner. We have 100 subjects in common, and we look at so many aspects of the world through the same pair of eyes. I only know that when I have been talking to her for a period, there is no exact measurement of time for me when I am with her. I leave her presence feeling completed. I feel that a sort of gap within my being has been filled, that a spiritual hunger has been satisfied, that I have got something which I wanted, but for which I could not have formulated the desire in words. I had resolved that on this first night I would bring matters between us to a head and end this delicious but intolerable uncertainty as to how we stood. Yet when old Babette had served us with coffee in the drawing room, as I call the 2nd living room, and we were alone together, I could not bring up the subject. Partly because I think she prevented me so doing by that skillful shepherding of the conversation into other paths, with an artfulness with which God endows all women, and also partly because I could not screw myself up to the pitch. I could not, or rather would not, put my fate to the touch. I had a presentiment that in reaching for the summit, I might fall from the slope. Alas, how true was this foreboding in some senses, but I will keep all things in their right order. The track met a ram. In the flash, I caught a glimpse of his conning tower. Let it only be recorded that, when she kissed me good night, with the tenderness of a mother, and left me to smoke a final cigar, I had said nothing. And I could only wonder at the strange fate that had placed me practically alone with a girl whom I had grown to love with a deep emotion, and who appeared to love me, yet often behaved as if I was her brother. The next day we were like 2 children. The snow was deep on the ground, and the fir trees stood like thousands of sentinels in gray uniform round the clearing. Once during the afternoon, as with Zoe's assistance, I was furiously chopping wood for the fire. A droning noise made me look up, and thousands of meters overhead a small squadron of aeroplanes, evidently bound for the Western Front, sailed slowly across the sky. I thought how awkward it would be for them if they experienced an engine failure whilst over the forest, though they were up so high that I imagine they could have glided 10 kilometers, and as I think, but I am not certain, and I have pledged myself not to try and find out. We were in the forest of Montellin, which is barely 15 kilometers broad. I suppose they could have fallen clear of the trees. As a matter of fact, I imagine they would have used our clearing. I'm glad they didn't. That night after dinner, she played to me, first Beethoven and then Chopin. I can see her as I write. She had just finished the 14th prelude, and resting her chin on her hand, she smiled mysteriously at me. The hour had come, and driven by strong impulses, I spoke. I told her that I loved her as I had never thought that a man could love a woman. I told her that I longed to shield her and protect her, and above all things to remove her from the clutches of that bestial colonel. and as I bent over her and felt my senses swim in the subtleties of her perfume, I begged her passionately to say the word that would give me the right to fight the world on her behalf. When I had finished, she was silent for a long while, and I can remember distinctly that I wondered whether she could hear the thump, thump of my heart, which to my agitated mind seemed to beat with the strength of a hammer. At length she spoke. 2 words came slowly from her lips. I cannot. I was not discouraged. I could see, I could feel that a tremendous struggle was raging, the outward signs of which were concealed by her averted head. At length I asked her point blank whether she loved me. Her silence gave me my answer, and I took her unresisting body into my arms and kissed her to distraction. Oh, these kisses, how bitter they seemed to me now, and yet how I longed to hold her once again. For, freeing herself from my embrace and speaking almost mechanically, she said, Karl, I must tell you, I cannot marry you. I pleaded, I prayed, I argued, I demanded. It was in vain. I always came up against the immovable I cannot. And then I crashed over the precipice towards whose edge I had been blindly going. I had said for the 100th time, but you know you love me, when with a sob she abandoned all reserve and flinging her arms round my neck, implored me to take her. Then, as I caught my breath, she quickly said, as if frightened that she had gone too far, but I cannot marry you. I looked down into those beautiful eyes, and for the first time I understood. For perhaps 10 seconds I battled for my soul and the purity of our love. Then, tearing my sight from those eyes which would lure an archangel to destruction, I was once more master of my body. As my resolution grew, I hated her for doing this thing that had wrecked in an instant the hopes of months, the ideals on which I had begun to build afresh my life. She felt the change and left me. As she went out by the door, she gave me one last look, a look in which love struggled with shame, a look which no man has ever earned the right to receive from any woman. But I was as a statue of marble, dazed by this calamity. As the door closed upon her, I started forward. It was too late. Had she waited another instant, but there, I write of what has happened and not what might have been. I did not sleep that night, until the dawn began to separate each fir tree from the black mass of the forest. Twice in the night, with shame I confess it, I opened my door and looked down the little passageway. And twice I closed the door and threw myself upon my bed in an agony of torment. It was 10 o'clock when a knock at the door aroused me, and the sunlight through the window pane was tracing patterns on the floor. There was a note on the breakfast table, but before I opened it, I knew that, save for Babette, I was alone in the house. The note was brief, unaddressed, and unsigned. I have it here before me. I have meant to tear it up, but I cannot. It is a weakness to keep it, but I have lost so much in the last few days that I will not grudge myself some small relic of what has been. The note says, I am leaving for Bruges at 8:30, when the car was ordered to fetch us back. I go alone. Babette will give you breakfast. The car will return for you at 11 o'clock. I rely on your honor in that you will not observe where you have been. Come to me when you want me. Till then, farewell. It was as she said, and I honorably acceded to her request. This afternoon, just before lunch, I arrived in Bruges, and since tea time, I have tried to write down what has happened since I left the day before yesterday. Oh, how could she do it? How can it be possible that she is a woman like that? I could have sworn that she was not like this, and yet how can I account for her life with the colonel? There must be some reason, but in heaven's name, what? Meanwhile, I am to go to her when I want her, and that will be when I can give her my name. But oh, Zoe, I want you now so badly, oh, so badly. I saw her once today in the gardens, walking by herself. I have told Max's secretary that I want to get to sea, to be here in Bruges, and not to see her is more than I can bear. I sail at dawn tomorrow. Shall I see her? No, it is best not. A frightful noise over the New Year celebrations tonight. Champagne flowing like water in the mess. I feel the year 1917 opens badly for me. Weissman also went to sea again for a short trip in the Channel and has not reported for 5 days. Perhaps he has despised the Dover barrage once too often. If this is so, it is a great loss to the service. He was a man of iron resolution in underwater attack. I feel I ought to despise Zoe, but I can't. I love her too much. After all, am I not perhaps encasing myself in the robe of a Pharisee? She offered me all she had, save only the one thing I asked, without which I will take nothing. I cannot reconcile her behavior with her character. Why can't she trust me? Why can't she be frank with me? I will not believe she is that sort. I feel I cannot go out again without a sign I may not return. And I will not leave her, perhaps forever, with this bitterness between us.